Good evening and welcome back to Almighty Sleep. Tonight we follow a single human mind, one that sketched flying machines 400 years before the airplane, mapped the human body before modern medicine existed, and painted a smile so subtle that scientists are still arguing about it today. Leonardo da Vinci was not simply a painter or an inventor or a scientist. He was all of those things at once, and somehow also none of them entirely. A man who began everything and finished almost nothing, who left behind notebooks so dense with ideas that we're still unpacking them now. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. The illegitimate child of Vinci. The village of Vinci sits in the Tuscan hills about 30 kilometers west of Florence. If you drive there today, which I highly recommend doing if you ever get the chance, you wind up a narrow road through vineyards and olive groves, past farmhouses with terracotta roofs and shuttered windows, until the land opens onto a view so quietly beautiful that it almost feels staged. The hills roll in long soft waves. Cypress trees stand in dark vertical lines against the pale sky. The air smells of earth and rosemary and something older that you cannot quite name. In 1452, Vinci was a modest agricultural community, part of the Florentine territory, governed at a comfortable distance by the great city on the other side of the hills. The people who lived there were farmers, craftsmen, notaries, and landowners. Life moved slowly and predictably, governed by seasons and harvests and the rhythms of the Catholic Church. Nobody was particularly famous. Nobody had any reason to expect that anything remarkable was about to happen. And then, on the 15th of April, 1452, a child was born. His name was Leonardo, and he was, from the very first moment of his existence, slightly outside the rules. His father was Ser Piero da Vinci, a 25-year-old notary from a respectable local family with a long tradition of legal work. Notaries in Renaissance Italy were important figures. They drafted contracts, authenticated documents, and served as the connective tissue of commercial and civic life. Ser Piero was ambitious, well-connected, and on his way up. He would go on to have 4 wives across his lifetime, though not all at once, and sire at least 12 children, though not all with those wives. Leonardo was one of the ones who was not with a wife. His mother was a young woman named Caterina, whose last name we are not entirely certain of, which tells you something about the difference in how history treated the two of them. She was likely a peasant girl, possibly an orphan, possibly a servant in the Da Vinci household or nearby. The exact nature of her relationship with Ser Piero remains unclear, though the result of it is obvious enough. She was not someone Ser Piero could or would marry. Social boundaries in 15th century Tuscany were firm about that kind of thing. What happened next reflects both the limitations and occasional tenderness of the era. Within months of Leonardo's birth, Ser Piero married a respectable woman named Albiera, while Caterina married a local farmer and kiln worker named Antonio di Piero del Vacca, who was apparently known in the village by the cheerful nickname Accattabriga, which translates roughly as quarrelsome one. Whether this nickname was affectionate or a genuine warning about the man's temperament, history does not fully clarify. Leonardo went to live with his father's family. This was not as cold as it sounds in modern terms. Illegitimate children in Renaissance Italy occupied a complicated but not necessarily desperate position. They could not inherit property or titles in the same way legitimate children could, and they were barred from certain professions, including, somewhat ironically given what Ser Piero did for a living, the notarial profession. But they were not necessarily abandoned or ignored. And in Leonardo's case, the records suggest he was welcomed into the Da Vinci household and raised alongside his grandparents and his uncle Francesco, who was only 15 years older than the boy, and became something of a companion and mentor to him in the earliest years. His grandfather Antonio kept meticulous records. Among the entries in his notebook is a brief, matter-of-fact note recording the birth of his grandson. It reads, in part, that a grandson was born, the son of Ser Piero my son, on the 15th day of April. The note lists the godparents and the priest who performed the baptism. It is brief, it is practical. It gives no indication whatsoever that this particular child is going to be anything other than what the world around him expected him to be. Grandparents are often the last people to be surprised by the future. What was Leonardo's childhood actually like? Here we have to be careful, because the documentary record is thin, and the romantic imagination of later centuries has sometimes been more enthusiastic than accurate. We know that he grew up in and around Vinci, in a household that was moderately comfortable. We know that the landscape around him was extraordinarily beautiful, and that he spent a great deal of time in it. Later in his notebooks, Leonardo would write about a childhood memory of a kite, the large bird of prey, swooping down and striking him on the face while he lay in his cradle. He interpreted this memory, or possibly this dream, as a prophetic sign of his destiny with flight. Whether the event actually happened is another matter entirely. Leonardo was not above a certain amount of self-mythology. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that the Tuscan landscape shaped him in ways that never left. The hills, the water, the movement of air, the quality of light in the late afternoon when it turns the stone walls gold. These things entered his eye early and never departed. When you look at the backgrounds of his paintings decades later, with their misty peaks and winding rivers and atmosphere that seems to exist slightly outside ordinary time, you're seeing a Tuscany that lived inside him since childhood. He would also have grown up with a complicated relationship to his own identity. Not quite part of his father's legitimate family, not quite connected to his mother's household either, though Caterina seems to have remained in the area, and Leonardo likely knew her. He occupied an in-between space, which sounds painful and perhaps sometimes was. But in-between spaces have a way of producing people who see the world from unusual angles. When you do not belong entirely to any one category, you develop a habit of observation. You watch how groups work from slightly outside them. You notice things that insiders cannot see. This habit of observation would become the defining characteristic of everything Leonardo ever did. His formal education was limited. He attended what was called an abaco school, the kind of practical school available to boys of his social standing, where he learned reading, writing, and basic arithmetic. He did not receive the classical humanist education that wealthy Florentine boys were given, with its deep immersion in Latin and Greek texts. Leonardo would later describe himself as an uomo senza lettere, a man without letters, though this was partly false modesty and partly a genuine statement about his relationship to the traditional academic world. What it really meant was that Leonardo learned differently. He learned by looking. He learned by doing. He learned by questioning the thing directly, rather than consulting what previous authorities had written about it. In an age when the study of nature was still largely filtered through Aristotle and the Church Fathers, this was not the normal approach. It was, in many ways, the approach of a man who had not been told the rules clearly enough to be limited by them. His uncle Francesco took him out into the fields and hillsides and taught him to pay attention to the natural world, the movement of water in a stream, the way a bird's wing changed shape mid-flight, the structure of a flower when you pulled it apart to see what was inside. These early lessons in careful looking were not framed as science or art. They were just the passing observations of a man who liked the countryside and a boy who had nothing better to do than follow him. But in Leonardo's case, careful looking was never just careful looking. It was the beginning of everything. By the time he was around 14 or 15, it had become clear that the boy had a remarkable gift for drawing. Not just a pleasant ability, but something that made people stop and look twice. Ser Piero, whatever his failings as an attentive father, was a practical man. He could see what was in front of him, and what was in front of him was a son with an unusual talent who needed to be pointed in a useful direction. The useful direction, it turned out, was Florence, and specifically, the workshop of one of the city's most celebrated artists, a man named Andrea del Verrocchio. Leonardo would have left Vinci sometime around 1464 or 1466. He was perhaps 14 years old, perhaps a little older. The records are imprecise. He would have travelled the 30 kilometres to Florence on foot or by donkey along roads that wound through the same hills he had grown up watching. It was a short journey in physical terms. In every other sense, it was the end of one world and the beginning of another. He left behind the village, the olive groves, the kite swooping overhead, the grandfather's notebook entries, and Caterina. He arrived in Florence with whatever he had been able to carry, and a habit of looking at things more carefully than most people thought was strictly necessary. That habit was about to be given the finest possible education. The workshop of Verrocchio, where genius learns to see Florence in the 1460s, was the most exciting city in the Western world. It is not too dramatic to say so. Under the Medici family, and particularly under Cosimo de' Medici and later his grandson Lorenzo, the city had become something unprecedented. A republic in theory, a sophisticated oligarchy in practice, and a cultural powerhouse in every observable way. The streets were full of artists, scholars, engineers, merchants, and philosophers. The great dome of Santa Maria del Fiore, completed by Filippo Brunelleschi in 1436, still dominated the skyline and was still capable of making grown men stop in the street and stare upward with their mouths open. Art was not a marginal activity in this city. It was central to politics, to religion, to commerce, and to the competitive self-presentation of the families and institutions that paid for it. The Medici, the great banking clans, the guilds, the churches, all understood that beautiful things announced important things about who you were and what you valued. Patronage was not charity, it was strategy. Into this world stepped Andrea del Verrocchio, and I want to spend some time with him, because he tends to get somewhat overshadowed by the young man who would become his most famous pupil, which is a little unfair. Verrocchio was an extraordinary figure in his own right. Born around 1435, Andrea di Michele di Francesco de Sioni, who adopted the professional name Verrocchio, was one of the most versatile artists working in Florence. He was primarily a sculptor, producing work in bronze and marble that combined technical mastery with an emotional expressiveness that was genuinely innovative. His bronze David, commissioned by the Medici and now in the Bargello Museum in Florence, is a remarkable piece of work. A lean, slightly androgynous adolescent with an almost insolent tilt to his chin, the severed head of Goliath at his feet. It is nothing like Michelangelo's later David, which is large and heroic and practically vibrates with ideal masculine energy. Verrocchio's David is specific and a little strange and utterly alive, but Verrocchio was not just a sculptor. His workshop produced painting, goldsmith work, decorative objects, architectural plans, and stage machinery for theatrical productions. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of multidisciplinary creative mind that would appeal to a boy who had not yet decided which single thing he was most interested in. The answer, as it turned out, was going to be all of them. But that realization was still some years away. The Florentine workshop system was the primary institution through which art was learned and produced in the Renaissance. A master artist ran a bottega, a workshop where apprentices and assistants of varying levels of experience worked together on commissions. The master designed the work, supervised its execution, and put his name on the finished product. The apprentices and assistants contributed labour at every level, from grinding pigments and preparing panels to actually painting significant portions of major works. It was a collaborative system that modern ideas of individual authorship can struggle with, but it was enormously effective at maintaining quality and training new generations of artists. Leonardo joined Verrocchio's workshop as a garzone, a young apprentice probably around 1464 to 1466. He would have started at the bottom, as everyone did, sweeping floors, grinding pigments, running errands, watching, always watching. What he would have watched was remarkable. Verrocchio's workshop at this time was probably the most technically accomplished in Florence. Other artists sent their most difficult problems there. When Verrocchio's team was contracted to place a gilt bronze ball atop Brunelleschi's Great Dome in 1471, it was understood that this required not just artistic skill, but engineering precision, at a scale most workshops could not manage. Leonardo was there for that project, and it is worth pausing to appreciate what he would have absorbed from it. The mathematics of large-scale construction, the problem of lifting heavy objects to great heights, the behaviour of metal under heat and pressure. These were not art lessons, they were engineering lessons, and they stuck. The workshop also brought Leonardo into contact with some of the finest minds in Florence. Verrocchio knew Botticelli. He knew the Pollaiuolo brothers. He knew the architects and theorists and scholars who circulated through the Medici court. The 15-year-old boy from Vinci was suddenly in a room with the most interesting people in the most interesting city in the world. Whatever social awkwardness might have come from his illegitimate birth, whatever discomfort he might have felt as an outsider, the workshop gave him a community and a context. It was the first place he had ever entirely belonged. His talent became apparent with what must have been startling speed. The famous story, recorded by the art historian Giorgio Vasari, who wrote his Lives of the Artists about a century after Leonardo's time, is that Verrocchio asked his young apprentice to paint one of the angels in a collaborative altarpiece now known as the Baptism of Christ. When Leonardo completed his figure, Verrocchio looked at it and immediately stopped painting altogether, because the boy had surpassed him so completely that continuing seemed pointless. Now, Vasari is not always the most reliable narrator. He had a talent for a good story, and he was not writing journalism. But the story contains a kernel of truth that matters regardless of the exact details. In the Baptism of Christ, which still exists and hangs in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, the two figures of angels on the left side of the painting are demonstrably different in quality. One is stiffer, more conventional, more typical of Verrocchio's workshop style. The other, the one attributed to Leonardo, is liquid and luminous, with a quality of light in the face and a softness in the shadows that simply does not look like anything else being produced in Florence in the 1470s. It looks, frankly, like a different level of ability entirely. Verrocchio did not stop painting entirely after this, whatever Vasari claims. But there is good reason to believe he shifted increasingly towards sculpture in his later years, and there is equally good reason to believe that Leonardo's presence in the workshop changed the internal hierarchy of talent quite quickly. What did Leonardo learn from Verrocchio? Several things that proved foundational. First, he learned the fundamental importance of drawing. Verrocchio was an obsessive draftsman, and his workshop produced quantities of preparatory drawings that were extraordinary in their precision and sensitivity. Leonardo absorbed this approach completely, and then extended it far beyond what his master had imagined. His drawing practice would become, over decades, one of the most extraordinary bodies of graphic work ever produced by any human being. Second, he learned to look at the human body. Verrocchio's sculptures are notable for their anatomical attentiveness, the surface of the skin over muscle and bone, the specific way a hand holds an object, the tension in a wrist or neck. These things required observation, and Verrocchio taught his apprentices to observe rather than to copy conventional formulas. This planted a seed in Leonardo that would eventually grow into one of the most extraordinary programs of anatomical research the world had ever seen. Third, and perhaps most broadly, Leonardo learned in Verrocchio's workshop that the boundaries between art, engineering, architecture, and science were not fixed. The same mind that could conceive a beautiful sculpture could also solve the engineering problem of getting it to the top of a dome. The same eye that could capture a human face could also analyze the mathematics of proportion. The division of knowledge into separate disciplines was, in Verrocchio's world, a convenience rather than a necessity. This lesson too took root in Leonardo and never let go. By his early 20s, Leonardo had risen to the status of a full journeyman in the workshop, capable of independent work. In 1472 he was enrolled in the Company of St. Luke, the Florentine Painters' Guild, which meant he was officially recognized as a professional artist in his own right. He continued to work with Verrocchio's bottega for several more years, but the relationship was shifting. The apprentice was becoming the master, even if neither of them fully acknowledged it yet. There is one more thing about the workshop years that deserves attention, and it is a little uncomfortable to discuss, partly because the evidence is ambiguous, and partly because it involves a criminal accusation. In 1476, Leonardo was anonymously denounced to the Florentine authorities in connection with an alleged act of sodomy involving a young male model named Jacopo Saltarelli. The charge was serious. Sodomy was a criminal offence in Florence and could carry severe penalties including public flogging or worse. The case was dismissed twice for lack of evidence. Leonardo was acquitted, but the experience left its mark. He became more private, more guarded, more careful about what he revealed of himself and to whom. The notebooks that would become the great record of his inner life were written in his characteristic mirror script, right to left, which some scholars interpret as a deliberate effort to make them difficult to read without a mirror. Whether that was the primary purpose or just a habit born of left-handedness remains debated. But the secrecy was real. About his personal and emotional life, Leonardo left almost nothing explicit behind. He never married. His household in later years included young male assistants and pupils to whom he seems to have been emotionally attached, though the precise nature of those attachments remains unclear. He wrote in his notebooks that the act of physical love was repellent to him, though this may say more about his particular psychology than about any single aspect of his identity. What can be said with some confidence is that Leonardo moved through the world as a person who kept the deepest parts of himself behind a polished and impressive surface. Charming, apparently, physically beautiful by all accounts, well-dressed, an excellent musician, a delightful conversationalist, and also, underneath all of that, profoundly alone. But that aloneness too would prove useful, because it drove him inward, into the notebooks, into the endless private dialogue with himself that produced the most extraordinary record of a thinking mind that the Renaissance left behind. The first Florentine years, ambition, beauty, and unfinished things. By the late 1470s, Leonardo da Vinci was in his mid-20s and operating as an independent artist in Florence. He had the training, the reputation, and the connections. He had Verrocchio's endorsement, however implicit, and the access to Florentine patronage networks that came with it. By any reasonable measure, the conditions were in place for a steady and distinguished career. What happened instead was something considerably more interesting and considerably less tidy. Leonardo began projects. He developed ideas. He produced drawings of breathtaking complexity and ambition. And then, with a frequency that became almost characteristic, he did not finish things. This is one of the great puzzles of Leonardo's career, and it is worth sitting with it for a moment rather than rushing past it. The incomplete works are not a minor footnote, they are a central fact of his life. Of the paintings he is known to have begun, a surprisingly large proportion were never finished. Of the books he planned to write on subjects ranging from painting to anatomy, to water, to the flight of birds, none were published in his lifetime. The notebooks contain thousands of pages of observations, plans, designs, and calculations that were never organized into coherent final form. Later generations have sometimes romanticized this incompleteness, suggesting that Leonardo's ambition simply exceeded the capacity of a single human lifetime. And there is truth in that. The sheer scope of what he wanted to know and do and make was genuinely impossible to complete. But there is also something more complicated going on, something that has to do with how Leonardo's mind actually worked and what he actually valued. Leonardo was more interested in the problem than the solution, more interested in the question than the answer, more interested in the process of understanding something than in the object that emerged at the end of the process. A painting, once finished, was fixed. It could no longer be improved or reconsidered. A painting in progress could always be pushed a little further, made a little more true, brought a little closer to the impossible ideal in his head. The act of finishing something was, in a sense, the act of accepting its limitations, and Leonardo found that acceptance genuinely difficult. The patrons who commissioned work from him found this genuinely maddening. We will return to this theme repeatedly across his life, because it recurs with wonderful consistency. The first major commission of his independent career was, appropriately enough, unfinished. In 1478, he received a commission from the Signoria, the Florentine government, for an altarpiece in the chapel of San Bernardo in the Palazzo della Signoria. He was paid in advance. He produced some preparatory drawings. He did not produce the painting. The commission was eventually given to someone else. Also in 1478, he began work on a commissioned painting of the Madonna and Child for the church of San Donato Scopito. This project transformed, over several years, into something extraordinary. Rather than a simple devotional image, Leonardo developed a complex multi-figure composition showing the adoration of the Magi, with the infant Christ at the centre and a swirling crowd of figures around him expressing every variation of human response to the miraculous. The preparatory work for this painting is staggering. Dozens of drawings survive, working out individual figures, compositional arrangements, architectural backgrounds, horses in motion, faces in states of astonishment and contemplation and joy. The single, large panel that remains, now in the Uffizi, shows a work of remarkable ambition in its underdrawing and early paint layers. The spatial organization is revolutionary. The emotional complexity of the figures anticipates developments in painting that would not become standard for another generation. It was never finished. Leonardo left Florence in 1482 and left the painting behind. The monks of San Donato eventually commissioned a completed version from another artist entirely. What kept drawing him back was the city itself. Florence in the early 1480s was still Lorenzo de' Medici's city, and Lorenzo's Florence was a genuinely extraordinary environment. Lorenzo, who would earn the title Il Magnifico, the Magnificent, combined political acumen with genuine cultural sophistication. His court attracted poets, philosophers, scholars, and artists in what amounted to the most concentrated gathering of intellectual talent in Europe. The Platonic Academy, a loose circle of humanist scholars who gathered under Lorenzo's informal patronage, was debating ideas drawn from newly recovered ancient texts. Marsilio Ficino was translating Plato. Pico della Mirandola was arguing for the dignity of man. The air was thick with ideas. Leonardo was in this world, but not entirely of it. His lack of classical Latin education put him somewhat outside the inner circle of Platonic humanists, and he was aware of this. He compensated partly by working harder than anyone else at acquiring knowledge through direct observation rather than textual authority. But he also compensated by developing his own presence in the city that had nothing to do with scholarship. He was beautiful, apparently. Contemporary accounts describe him as tall, physically impressive, graceful, with long blonde hair worn in careful ringlets and a face that stopped conversation. He dressed well, maintained a small but elegant household, and was known for his ability to improvise on the lyre while composing lyrics spontaneously. He was what we might call, in contemporary terms, extremely charismatic. He could also, by all accounts, design the most extraordinary party entertainments Florence had ever seen. Mechanical devices, theatrical special effects, allegorical pageants that combined engineering and aesthetics in ways that left audiences astonished. These productions were not trivial. In Renaissance Florence, the ability to stage a magnificent spectacle was a significant political and social skill. Lorenzo understood this, the great families understood this, and Leonardo understood it perfectly. But Lorenzo himself, despite being the most powerful patron in Florence, never gave Leonardo a significant painting commission. This puzzles historians. Some suggest that Lorenzo found Leonardo's habits of incompletion too risky for major commissions. Others suggest that their relationship was warm, but that Lorenzo's specific tastes ran more toward other artists, toward Botticelli's linear elegance, toward the precise classicism of younger painters. Whatever the reason, Leonardo was part of the Medici world without being at its centre, which must have been both stimulating and quietly frustrating. During these years, however, he was developing at a speed and across a range that had no precedent. His drawing practice was becoming extraordinary. The notebooks that survive from this period, and the drawings attributed to it, show a mind accelerating in every direction simultaneously. Studies of human faces in extreme emotional states, drawn from life with an intensity that borders on uncomfortable. Studies of plants and animals with a scientific precision that preceded formal natural history by over a century. Studies of water in motion, of drapery, of architectural forms, and everywhere, written in his left-handed mirror script, notes to himself about what he was seeing and thinking and wondering. He also began, during this period, to think seriously about painting as a theoretical as well as practical enterprise. He was accumulating material for what would eventually become his treatise on painting, a work he planned and worked toward for decades without ever completing in publishable form. The theoretical positions he was developing were significant. He argued for the superiority of painting over all other arts, including sculpture and poetry, which required a certain amount of nerve in a city full of sculptors and poets. He argued that the painter must be a scientist as well as a craftsman. He argued that the eye was the noblest of the senses, and that the visual image was the highest form of knowledge. These were not just aesthetic opinions, they were also a kind of autobiography. Leonardo was constructing an intellectual framework that justified the way his own mind worked, the way it moved from looking to understanding to making, without being able to entirely separate those three activities from each other. In 1481 or 1482, Ser Piero da Vinci, his father, appears to have helped arrange something that would change his son's life. A letter was sent either by Ser Piero or with his assistants to Ludovico Sforza, the effective ruler of Milan, proposing Leonardo's services. The letter was remarkable. It described Leonardo not primarily as a painter, but as a military engineer, a designer of weapons and fortifications and siege machines, with painting almost an afterthought at the end of a long list of engineering capabilities. Whether all those capabilities were as fully developed as the letter claimed is a question we can cheerfully set aside. The point is that the pitch worked. Leonardo was invited to Milan. He packed his things, took along a silver lyre he had made himself in the shape of a horse's skull, which is admittedly quite a choice as a travel companion, and left Florence behind. He was 30 years old. He had produced almost nothing finished. He had already demonstrated an ability to see further and think more comprehensively than anyone around him, and he was about to enter the most productive sustained period of his life. Milan and the court of Ludovico Sforza Milan in 1482 was a different world from Florence. Where Florence was a republic built on banking and textile wealth and political culture, Milan was a duchy, a proper signoria, with a proper duke who ruled through inherited power, military force, and the elaborate theatre of courtly life. The Visconti family had ruled Milan for over a century before being succeeded by the Sforza, a dynasty that had begun as mercenary soldiers and risen, through strategic marriages and systematic violence, to control one of the most powerful states in northern Italy. The man Leonardo was going to work for was Ludovico Sforza, known as Il Moro, the Moor, a nickname derived either from his dark complexion or from a mulberry tree that was his personal emblem, or possibly both. Ludovico was not technically the Duke of Milan when Leonardo arrived. The actual Duke was Gian Galeazzo Sforza, who happened to be Ludovico's nephew, and who was also, conveniently for Ludovico, young, weak, and easily managed. Ludovico served as regent and wielded almost all real power. When Gian Galeazzo died in 1494 under circumstances that were at minimum suspicious, and at maximum the result of deliberate poisoning, Ludovico became duke in his own right. This is relevant context for understanding the environment Leonardo was working in. The Sforza court was magnificent and cultured, and also operated on the understanding that power was obtained and maintained through a combination of charm and ruthlessness. Ludovico himself was a genuinely complex figure. He was vain and manipulative and not above eliminating obstacles to his ambition. He was also a serious patron of the arts and learning, a man who understood that cultural prestige was a form of political currency. He supported poets and scholars and musicians. He rebuilt and expanded his court in ways that made it one of the grandest in Italy. And he was, over the 17 years that Leonardo spent in his service, a patron of extraordinary scope, if not always the most attentive one. Leonardo arrived with his horse-skull lyre and presented himself at court. According to Vasari, he was asked to play for Ludovico, which he did with great skill, and this alone would have been enough to earn him some welcome. Musicians were valued at court, and Leonardo's ability to improvise and compose gave him an immediate social currency. But the relationship quickly developed into something much more interesting. Leonardo's role at the Sforza court was officially that of a court artist and engineer. In practice, this meant almost everything. He designed theatrical spectacles for court entertainments, which were elaborate and technically demanding and deeply impressive. He worked on architectural projects, including plans for an ideal city that were never realized. He consulted on engineering questions related to canals and fortifications. He began large-scale painting projects. He conducted scientific investigations into every subject that interested him, which was essentially every subject there was. And he had, for the first time in his life, something that Florence had never quite given him: resources, time, space. The Sforza court was wealthy enough to support him at a level that allowed his investigations to expand. He had assistants and pupils, he had access to library materials. He had the slightly chaotic freedom of a court environment where the demand was for brilliance in general, rather than the completion of any specific list of tasks. He also had, for better and worse, a patron whose attention was wildly inconsistent. The great obsessive project of the early Milan years was not a painting, it was a horse. Specifically, it was the largest bronze equestrian statue in the world, commissioned by Ludovico to honour his father Francesco Sforza, the founder of the dynasty. The project was known as the Gran Cavallo, the Great Horse, and it would consume more of Leonardo's time and energy and emotional investment over more years than any other single project he ever undertook. The ambition was staggering. Previous bronze equestrian statues, including the famous Gattamelata by Donatello and the Colleoni by Verrocchio, were large and impressive. Leonardo planned something 3 times the size of the Gattamelata, a rearing horse over 7 meters tall that would have required an entirely new approach to bronze casting, at a scale never before attempted. He spent years studying horses. He visited the Sforza stables and made hundreds of drawings, capturing the anatomy and movement and musculature of the animals, with a scientific rigour that was simultaneously artistic preparation and independent zoological research. The drawings that survive from this project are among the most beautiful animal studies ever made. He worked out over many years the engineering of the casting, how to create moulds of this size, how to pour bronze in quantities that would have been practically unprecedented. He produced a full-scale clay model of the horse, which was exhibited in 1493 to general astonishment. People came from across northern Italy to see it. Poets wrote verses about it. It was described as the 8th wonder of the world. The bronze was never cast. When France invaded Italy in 1494 and Ludovico found himself in desperate need of military resources, the 75 tons of bronze that had been set aside for the statue were melted down and used to make cannons. French soldiers later used the clay model for target practice with crossbows. It was destroyed. Nothing physical of it survives. I want to pause here, because this moment is almost too perfectly symbolic to be real, and yet it is. The greatest artistic project of the first half of Leonardo's career, the one he had poured the most work into, was literally turned into weapons and then destroyed by people with weapons. If you were writing a novel about Leonardo da Vinci, you would probably be warned against including this detail on the grounds that it was too neat. But history does not consult novelists. Beyond the horse, the Milan years were extraordinarily productive in ways that are easy to underestimate because so much of the work was happening in the notebooks, rather than in publicly visible finished objects. This is the period when Leonardo's investigations began to develop the systematic character that distinguishes them from the observations of even other very smart people. He was not just noticing things. He was developing methods for studying things. He was thinking about how to think about problems. He was, without quite having a name for it, developing something very close to what we would now call scientific method. The notebooks from the Milan years cover astonishing ranges of territory: optics and the behavior of light, the mathematics of proportion, music theory, the geometry of fortifications, studies of shadows and how they behave at different times of day, plans for canal systems that would improve navigation across Lombardy, designs for mechanical devices including pumps and looms and mechanisms for lifting heavy loads, studies of the moon and whether it has its own light or reflects the sun, studies of fossils and what they might indicate about the age of the Earth. That last one is worth dwelling on for a moment. Leonardo observed marine fossils in the rocks of the Lombard Hills and concluded that they were the remains of real ancient sea creatures, not, as was the conventional wisdom of his time, objects that had grown in the rock or been placed there by God for mysterious reasons or washed there by Noah's flood. He further concluded that the layers of rock in which the fossils were embedded must have been deposited slowly over very long periods of time. This is essentially stratigraphic geology. It would not become an accepted scientific discipline for another 300 years. He was, in this as in so many things, working in a laboratory that had no name yet. He also began, during the Milan years, the two paintings that would establish his reputation for all time. The first was the Virgin of the Rocks, of which two versions exist, one now in the Louvre in Paris and one in the National Gallery in London. The second was the Last Supper, which we will examine in its own chapter because it deserves one entirely. The Virgin of the Rocks, in either version, is unlike any devotional painting that preceded it. The conventional Madonna and child compositions of the period were clear, bright, hierarchical. The sacred figures occupied defined positions in a defined space. Leonardo's painting places the Madonna, the infant Christ, the infant John the Baptist, and an angel in a mysterious rocky landscape that is simultaneously geological fact and spiritual atmosphere. The light is extraordinary, coming from no visible source, and illuminating the figures with a gentleness that seems to emanate from inside them, rather than falling on them from outside. The faces are tender and specific and completely unlike the idealized types that filled Florentine altarpieces. The whole thing feels like it was painted in a dream, or possibly by someone who had simply looked at the world more carefully than everyone else. Which brings us to sfumato. This is one of Leonardo's most significant technical innovations, and it deserves an explanation because it is central to understanding what makes his paintings look the way they do. Sfumato, from the Italian for smoke or evaporated, is a technique of applying paint in layers so thin and so subtle that hard edges between forms are dissolved into gradual transitions of tone and shadow. In conventional Renaissance painting, the edges of objects were typically defined clearly. The contour line was visible. Leonardo observed that in reality, when you look at a face or a figure, the edges between it and the background are not clear lines. They are blurred, softened by atmosphere and light. Sfumato was his attempt to paint what the eye actually sees rather than what the analytical mind knows is there. The effect, when you see a Leonardo painting in person, is uncanny. Things seem to breathe. Surfaces seem to have depth that goes beyond the physical depth of a thin layer of paint. Faces seem to think. This is not an accident, and it is not magic. It is the result of thousands of hours of observation translated into technique, with extraordinary patience and precision. He was, in the court of Ludovico Sforza, developing into the painter he would become. He was also becoming the scientist and engineer and polymath he had always been heading toward being. The two projects, the artistic and the investigative, were not separate in his mind. They were the same project, approached from different angles. By the early 1490s, Leonardo was at the height of his powers and at the centre of one of the most brilliant courts in Italy. He had assistants and pupils who adored him. He had Ludovico's intermittent but genuinely supportive patronage. He had the notebooks, expanding year by year into a territory of knowledge that was entirely his own. He also had, in the refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie, a wall. The notebooks, a mind that never stopped. Before we reach the Last Supper, we need to spend some time inside the notebooks, because the notebooks are not supplementary material to Leonardo's life. They are his life, or the most private and most extraordinary part of it, the place where all the doors that his public face kept carefully closed were left quietly open. Let us establish some numbers because the numbers are genuinely startling. Leonardo produced an estimated 13,000 pages of notebook material across his lifetime. Of these, approximately 7,000 pages survive today, scattered across institutions and private collections in Milan, Paris, Windsor, Turin, Venice, Madrid, and elsewhere. They are written in his characteristic mirror script, read right to left, in a small and surprisingly elegant hand. They contain text and drawings mixed together without clear hierarchical separation. The words and images part of the same continuous thinking process. 7,000 pages. Just to be absolutely clear about what that represents in practical terms, if you read 30 pages of dense manuscript a day, it would take you over 8 months to get through what survives, and roughly half of what he produced is already gone. The range of subjects covered is so vast that listing them feels almost absurd. Painting technique, anatomy, optics, mathematics, mechanics, hydraulics, geology, botany, architecture, music theory, military engineering, urban planning, astronomy, meteorology, the flight of birds, the movement of water, the growth of plants, the structure of the eye, the function of the heart, the behavior of shadows, the nature of beauty, the best way to divide a canal, how to preserve paint so it lasts longer, why the sky is blue. That last one, by the way, he essentially got right, concluding that it had to do with the interaction of light with particles in the atmosphere. Robert Bunsen and John Tyndall would spend a great deal of scientific effort in the 19th century establishing the principle that Leonardo had sketched out in a notebook sometime around 1490. How did he work in the notebooks? This is worth examining carefully because it reveals something important about how his mind actually operated. He did not sit down to write a treatise and then fill in the sections. He worked associatively, laterally, in ways that look to modern eyes sometimes like chaos, and sometimes like a form of thinking that has no good analogy. A typical page might begin with a note about the angle at which light strikes a curved surface, then shift to a sketch of a mechanical device for lifting water, then contain a draft of a letter to someone about an unrelated matter, then include a shopping list, then return to the light problem from a different angle, then veer into a question about whether shadows have the same colour as the objects that cast them. All on the same page, in the same session of writing, the ideas bleeding into each other without clear demarcation. This is not disorganization. It is a specific kind of organization, one that keeps connections open rather than forcing premature closure. The notebooks work by analogy and association, by noticing that the structure of water flowing around an obstacle looks like the structure of air flowing around a wing, which looks like the structure of blood flowing through a bifurcated vessel. Drawing these analogies was not decorative. It was how Leonardo actually thought through problems. The comparison between different systems revealed structural truths that direct analysis sometimes missed. He was also an obsessive list maker. The notebooks are full of lists of things he wanted to do, things he wanted to learn, questions he wanted to answer, books he wanted to read, experiments he wanted to try. Some of these lists are heartbreaking in their ambition. One famous list, written sometime in the 1480s or 1490s, includes items such as get the master of arithmetic to show you how to square a circle, find a book on Milan and its churches which you are to get when you leave, get Vitellone which is in the library at Pavia and which deals with mathematics. Ask Benedetto Portinari by what means they walk on ice in Flanders. That last one is perhaps the most charming item in the entire canon of Renaissance scholarship. Somewhere in Milan in the late 1500s, Leonardo da Vinci looked out at an Italian winter and thought to himself, I wonder how they do that thing with skates in the Netherlands, and added it to his list of things to find out. He had, alongside everything else, a genuinely childlike delight in the world that made him want to understand everything, including ice skating. The notebooks also reveal something about Leonardo's emotional interior that his public persona carefully concealed. He could be sharp and funny. The notes occasionally contain sardonic observations about his contemporaries, and he had a wonderfully dry sense of humour when he chose to deploy it. He was also, in private, deeply anxious about his failures and his incompletion, writing self-critical notes that reveal a man who held himself to standards he knew he was not meeting. One of the most haunting entries in the entire corpus appears to have been written sometime in the 1490s. Leonardo wrote, "Tell me if anything was ever done. Tell me. Tell me." The repetition carries a weight that sits outside the surrounding technical notes like a stone dropped into still water. He also wrote, as the notebooks go on, with increasing urgency about time. He was aware, from relatively early, that he was trying to do more than one life could contain. He wrote about the hours wasted in unnecessary conversation. He wrote about the night as the best time for thinking because the world was quiet and demanded less. He wrote about projects abandoned not from laziness but from the impossibility of completing everything at once. The notebooks were also his scientific laboratory. When he wanted to understand how light behaved in a dark room, he built a device that we would now call a camera obscura and made systematic observations of what it showed him. When he wanted to understand the structure of the human skull, he boiled away the flesh of cadavers and drew the bones from multiple angles simultaneously, developing techniques of cross-sectional illustration that would not become standard in anatomical atlases for another 3 centuries. When he wanted to understand the flight of birds, he went and watched birds for hours and then came back and filled pages with drawings and calculations. He was building, in the notebooks, an alternative encyclopedia of the natural world, one based not on received wisdom or classical authority, but on direct observation and repeated experiment. This was not an approach that had a name in his time. The word scientist did not exist. The concept of systematic empirical investigation was just beginning to crystallize as a distinct intellectual activity. Leonardo was one of the people crystallizing it, though because his notebooks were private and largely unpublished, he did not receive the historical credit for this that he might otherwise have earned. This is the melancholy paradox at the heart of the notebooks. They contain more original scientific observation and more genuine investigative achievement than almost any document produced in the Renaissance. And they had almost no influence on the subsequent development of European science because almost nobody read them. They circulated in manuscript among a small number of people after Leonardo's death, and some copies were made, but they were never edited, never organized, never published. The formal scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, Copernicus and Galileo and Kepler and Newton, proceeded in almost total ignorance of what Leonardo had already worked out. He was, in this as in so many things, ahead of his time in a way that his time could not accommodate. But the notebooks were not pointless, even in this narrower sense. They were the engine of everything else he did. They were where he worked through problems before painting them, where he tested ideas before building them, where he asked questions that made his looking more precise and his making more intelligent. Without the notebooks, the paintings would be different. Without the practice of careful observation and systematic recording that the notebooks demanded, the sfumato would have been a technique rather than a philosophy. The notebooks and the paintings were the same project. They were the record of a single mind trying to understand the world with the fullest possible engagement of everything it had. And what a mind it was! We should not, in our admiration, make the mistake of making it seem inhuman. The notebooks are full of humanity, full of the small anxieties and daily irritations and occasional delights of a life being lived, shopping lists and recipes and complaints about students who stayed out too late, observations about the behavior of cats, notes about a particularly good joke that someone told him, and on the same page, sometimes in the same paragraph, some of the most penetrating scientific observations made anywhere in Europe in the 15th century. He was not a machine. He was a man who happened to be paying more attention than everyone else. The Last Supper, painting time itself. The refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie is not large. It is a long rectangular hall, the kind of room that was designed for a specific practical purpose, feeding monks, and that accumulated additional significance over time because of what happened to one of its walls. When you enter it today, after queuing for your time ticket and passing through the humidity-controlled antechamber designed to protect the painting from the moisture you're carrying on your body, you find yourself in a room that feels simultaneously smaller and larger than you expected. Smaller, because the mural that covers the entire north wall is not in fact enormous, in the way that great paintings are sometimes enormous. It is large, certainly, 8.8 meters wide by 4.6 meters tall, but it does not fill the room with the kind of overwhelming scale that some masterpieces achieve. Larger, because when you look at it, the painted room in the painting extends the actual room in a way that is almost vertiginous. You feel as if you are looking through the wall into a space beyond it, and the figures in that space feel genuinely present in the room with you. Or rather, they feel almost present. Because the painting, it must be acknowledged, is not in good condition. It was not in good condition within 20 years of being finished. It has been restored multiple times, damaged by a doorway cut through it in the 17th century that removed Christ's feet, flooded, bombed adjacent to by a World War II air raid that somehow, miraculously, left the wall standing and subjected to cleaning methods across the centuries that range from well-intentioned to frankly alarming. What you are looking at today is partly Leonardo and partly the accumulated record of what has happened to Leonardo across 500 years, which is in itself a kind of historical document, though perhaps not the one you went to see. But even in its damaged state, even through the layers of restoration and deterioration, The Last Supper is simply unlike anything else that exists. Leonardo received the commission from Ludovico Sforza sometime around 1490 or 1491. The Dominican monks of Santa Maria delle Grazie had requested an image of the Last Supper for their refectory, which was standard practice. Dining halls in monasteries and convents frequently featured images of the Last Supper, because eating together was a ritual that carried explicit theological resonance, and the connection between the monastic meal and the sacred meal of Christ and his apostles was meaningful in daily life. There were hundreds of Last Supper paintings across Italy and Europe at this point. The iconography was well established. Leonardo's innovation was to take that established iconography and make it explosive. The traditional Last Supper showed Christ and the 12 apostles, arranged along one side of a long table, all facing outward, serene and identifiable and somewhat static. The moment depicted was usually the institution of the Eucharist, Christ's establishment of the sacred bread and wine, which was spiritually significant but not particularly dramatic. Leonardo chose a different moment. He chose the moment immediately after Christ says, "Verily I say unto you that one of you shall betray me," the moment of revelation. The moment when 12 specific human beings, each with his own personality and fears and guilt and loyalty and confusion, hear something that shatters the peace of the meal. The moment when everything is in motion, when the emotional wave of the announcement is still passing through the room and has not yet settled into anything. He was painting psychological time. That is the only way to describe it. Not a static arrangement of sacred figures, but a frozen instant of human psychological response, as specific and complex and true as anything that had ever been attempted in painting. The preparation was extraordinary, even by Leonardo's standards. He made hundreds of drawings studying individual faces in states of extreme emotion. He sought out specific people in Milan whose faces captured the expressions he needed, walking through markets and taverns and churches looking for the right jaw, the right brow, the right set of the eyes for each apostle. Vasari tells us that when he needed a model for Christ's face, he spent years looking and could not find anyone who seemed worthy, and that when he needed Judas, he finally found a suitable model in a convicted criminal. Whether these specific stories are true or embellished, the method they describe is accurate. Leonardo was looking for truth, not types. The application of the paint was another source of difficulty, and it would ultimately be the source of the painting's tragic deterioration. The conventional technique for murals was true fresco, buon fresco, in which pigments are applied to wet plaster and become chemically bonded with the wall as it dries. True fresco requires working quickly, completing each day's section before the plaster sets, and produces colours that are fixed and relatively durable. Leonardo hated working quickly. His working method, with its constant revisions and subtle refinements and layering of translucent glazes, was fundamentally incompatible with true fresco. He needed to be able to go back and change things. He needed to be able to work over a passage for weeks, making incremental adjustments. So he invented his own technique, painting in tempera and oil on a dried plaster surface that had been prepared with a ground of gesso and lead white. This gave him the flexibility he needed. It also created a surface that was fundamentally less stable than true fresco, one that would begin to deteriorate within a generation. He worked on the painting, with interruptions for other projects and investigations, for approximately 3 years. The prior of Santa Maria delle Grazie apparently complained to Ludovico about the pace, suggesting that Leonardo spent whole days standing in front of the painting doing nothing. Leonardo, through Ludovico, sent back a message explaining that the highest forms of creative work sometimes required extensive periods of contemplation that looked from the outside like inactivity. He also reportedly suggested that if the prior was in such a hurry, he could always use the prior's own face as the model for Judas. This was not a joke that improved relations with the monastery. The finished painting was recognized immediately as something entirely new. It was discussed throughout Italy and eventually throughout Europe. Artists and scholars made pilgrimages to Milan specifically to see it. Copies were made, engravings were commissioned. The composition entered the visual vocabulary of Western art so completely and so quickly that within a generation, the pre-Leonardo tradition of Last Supper paintings had been essentially superseded. What makes it work? The question is worth asking carefully because the elements of its success are not mysterious, even if the total effect is somewhat inexplicable. First, the light. It comes from two sources simultaneously. The painted windows in the background, which give the scene its setting and its recession into space, and the actual windows of the refectory, on the left wall, which illuminate the room and the painting from the same direction. Leonardo designed the painting so that its internal light source is aligned with the actual light of the room. The painting and the room breathe together. The apostles are lit as if they are actually in the space with you. Second, the composition. Christ is at the centre, surrounded by the 12 apostles arranged in 4 groups of 3. This arrangement is mathematically elegant and emotionally dynamic simultaneously. Each group has its own internal drama, its own response to the announcement. Thomas points upward with his characteristic gesture of demanding proof. Peter leans toward John to ask who the traitor is. Judas pulls back, his face in shadow, his hand closed around the purse. James the Elder throws his arms wide in what can only be described as a gesture of existential shock. Each group is distinct. The whole is unified. And Christ at the centre is simultaneously the still point around which all the motion turns and the cause of all the motion. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the faces. Every face is specific. Every face is a human being in a particular emotional state. The grief of John on Christ's right, so intense that he seems to have partially left the world. The outrage of Philip standing and gesturing toward his heart. The doubt and determination wrestling visibly in Thomas's expression. These are not symbolic figures arranged in theological order. They are people. Leonardo reportedly said that a good painter must paint 2 things above all, a person and the soul of a person. In the Last Supper, he managed exactly that. 12 souls in a single moment, and the soul of one more at the centre, who knows exactly what is about to happen and has accepted it entirely. The painting was finished around 1497 or 1498. It has been deteriorating, and being restored, and deteriorating again, ever since. And it is still, in its damaged and compromised and multiply-restored state, one of the most overwhelming things that human hands have produced. Anatomy and the body as machine. At some point during the Milan years, probably beginning in the late 1480s and continuing with increasing intensity through the 1490s and beyond, Leonardo began to open up human bodies. Not metaphorically, literally. He obtained cadavers from hospitals and charitable institutions that handled the bodies of the poor, and he dissected them by candlelight in conditions that were cold and dark and genuinely unpleasant, and he drew what he found. He would eventually conduct, by his own account, dissections of more than 30 human bodies, as well as numerous animals, including cows and bears and horses and birds and fish. He would fill hundreds of notebook pages with anatomical drawings of such precision and beauty and scientific intelligence that they remain extraordinary documents today, not just as art but as science. But let's begin at the beginning, because anatomy in the late 15th century was not what it is now, and the context matters. The study of the human body in Leonardo's time was governed primarily by the ancient authority of Galen, a 2nd century Greek physician whose anatomical writings had been the foundational texts of European medicine for over 1,000 years. Galen was brilliant, and his observations were in many respects remarkably accurate. He was also wrong about a significant number of things, some of them quite important, and because his authority was essentially unquestioned, those errors had been reproduced and taught and accepted as fact for 14 centuries without anyone systematically checking them against the actual bodies of actual people. The problem was partly theological. The dissection of human bodies was restricted by the Church, though the restrictions were less absolute than is sometimes suggested. Medical schools in Bologna and Padua conducted anatomical demonstrations, typically 1 or 2 per year, in which a professor read from Galen while a surgeon cut open a body and a demonstrator pointed to the structures being described. The hierarchy of these performances was instructive. The professor sat elevated above the body and read the text. The surgeon, a lower status figure, did the cutting. Nobody systematically compared what the text said with what the body showed. Leonardo reversed this entirely. He had no text he was reading from. He had the body in his eyes, he cut and he looked and he drew what he saw, and if what he saw did not match what Galen said, he noted the discrepancy without particular anxiety and drew what was actually there. What he found was frequently not what the authorities had described. The liver does not have the 5 lobes Galen attributed to it. The human uterus does not have the bicornate shape Galen described from cow anatomy, and assumed to be human as well. The blood does not move through the body in the way Galen's system predicted. The heart has 4 chambers, not 2. The optic nerves do not cross at the optic chiasm in the way traditional anatomy assumed. Leonardo got some of these right and some wrong, because he was working without context or comparison, purely from individual specimens that might not have been typical. But the approach was revolutionary regardless of the specific accuracy of each observation. He was doing what nobody before him had systematically done. He was looking at the actual thing and trying to draw what was actually there. His drawings of the human skull, produced around 1489, are among the earliest anatomical drawings and are still cited by historians of science for their sophistication. He depicted the skull in cross-section from multiple angles simultaneously, a technique he developed that showed the 3-dimensional structure more clearly than any single view could. He described the cranial nerves with remarkable precision. He explored the sinus cavities with evident curiosity, noting their function and structure in ways that suggest he understood more about respiratory anatomy than most of his contemporaries. His drawings of the fetus in the womb, made in the 1490s or early 1500s, are perhaps the most famous of all his anatomical works. The image of the curled fetus inside the opened uterus, surrounded by notes about its development and about the relationship between mother and child before birth, is one of the most beautiful and one of the most scientifically ambitious images he ever produced. He got some details wrong. For instance, the horned shape of the uterus comes from his cow dissections superimposed on human observation. But the fundamental image of the developing human being in the womb, rendered with tenderness and scientific precision simultaneously, remains genuinely astonishing. He was also thinking about the body as a machine. This is where Leonardo's anatomical investigation connects to his engineering investigations in ways that are entirely characteristic. He was interested in understanding how things worked, how the forces and structures of the body produced the movements and functions that kept it alive, because understanding the mechanism meant understanding the principle, and understanding the principle could be applied elsewhere. His studies of the arm and hand show the muscles and tendons and bones drawn in layers, peeled back one by one to show the underlying structure, with notes about how the forces work, how the bones function as levers, how the tendons transmit tension from muscle to joint. He explicitly compared the human body to mechanical systems in his engineering notebooks, suggesting that the same principles that governed machines could be found in living bodies, and vice versa. The heart received particular attention. Leonardo understood the heart as a pump, which seems obvious now but was not the framework his contemporaries were working with. He made careful observations of the heart's chambers and valves, and tried to understand how the valves worked, drawing studies of the aortic valve that are technically brilliant. He filled a glass model of the aortic root with water and grass seeds to observe the turbulence patterns that affected how blood moved through the valve. This was experimental fluid dynamics applied to biology. It was, in modern terms, biomedical engineering. He called it by neither of those names because neither of those names existed. He was also interested deeply and seriously in what the body meant, not just what it did, but what it was. He wrote in his notebooks about the difference between the soul and the body, about where in the body the soul might reside, about what happened to the person when the body stopped working. He was not a straightforwardly pious man. He held the conventional faith of his time at a somewhat cool distance, at least in private, and some of his notebook observations suggest a man who found the mechanistic explanation of living things both thrilling and disturbing. When he dissected a very old man who had told him before his death that he felt no pain, only a gradual failing, and found that the cause of death was essentially arteriosclerosis, the narrowing and hardening of the blood vessels with age, Leonardo recorded the finding with scientific precision and then wrote something unexpected. He described the death as gentle and peaceful, the body expiring like a lamp for lack of oil. He had found, in the mechanism, a kind of poetry. He had found, in the old man's body, a story about the aging and failing of all things that he found genuinely moving. This is the quality that makes Leonardo's anatomical work different from anyone else's. It is not just science, and it is not just art. It is both at once, inseparably, the way that looking and understanding and caring were always for him the same act. He planned to publish his anatomical studies in a comprehensive illustrated treatise that would have been the most advanced anatomical text ever produced. He never published it. The drawings and notes remained in the notebooks. When William Harvey finally demonstrated the circulation of the blood in 1628, Resolving questions that Leonardo had been asking 130 years earlier, he did so in complete ignorance of what Leonardo had already observed. We keep arriving at this point. The gap between what Leonardo knew and what the world knew. It is the gap that defines his peculiar position in history, the flying machines and the dream of flight. Of all the images associated with Leonardo da Vinci, the flying machines may be the most iconic and the most misunderstood. Ask someone who is not particularly interested in art history what they know about Leonardo, and there is a good chance they will mention the flying machine before they mention the Last Supper or the Mona Lisa. The flying machine has become a symbol of Leonardo himself, of the man who was ahead of his time, the dreamer, the impossibilist. The reality, as usual, is more interesting and more complicated than the symbol. Leonardo was obsessed with flight, genuinely, deeply, persistently obsessed with it across several decades of his life. His notebooks contain more than 500 drawings and sketches related to flight, aerodynamics, and the behavior of birds in the air. He studied the mechanics of flight with the same systematic intensity he brought to anatomy and engineering. He watched birds for hours and drew what he saw with extraordinary precision, capturing the changing configurations of a wing in motion, the relationship between wing position and air currents, the way a bird uses its tail as a rudder and its body as a counterbalance. This was not casual observation. He was doing aerodynamics. He was, in the notebooks, working toward an understanding of the physical principles that make flight possible, building on his studies of fluid dynamics and his analysis of the properties of air, which he correctly identified as having mass and therefore being capable of exerting and receiving force. He designed several flying machines. The most famous and the most frequently reproduced is the ornithopter, a device intended to mimic the flapping wing motion of a bird. The design shows a pilot lying face down on a platform and operating wing-like structures through a system of hand and foot levers. The pilot's muscular effort would, in theory, be transmitted to the wings in a way that replicated the mechanism of bird flight. Would it have worked? Almost certainly not. Not because the engineering was careless, but because the fundamental premise was flawed. Human muscles cannot generate anything close to the power-to-weight ratio that bird muscle achieves, and a mechanical system that simply multiplied human strength through levers would not overcome this. Leonardo may have understood this himself because his later flying machine designs move away from the ornithopter concept towards something more interesting. He also designed and drew what appears to be a working parachute, a pyramid-shaped canopy of starched linen with dimensions he calculated could support a human body in a controlled descent. Modern engineers and parachutists have tested reconstructions of this design and found that it works. Leonardo did not test it, but he thought it through with sufficient rigor that the idea was sound. He designed a device that looks remarkably like a helicopter, an aerial screw, a rotating blade designed to screw itself through air the way an Archimedes screw moves through water. The device as drawn could not have flown, partly because of structural issues and partly because the rotational problem, a helicopter rotor creates torque that will spin the body of the craft in the opposite direction unless countered, was not solved in his design. But the concept of a rotating lifting surface is there, clearly 400 years before the first practical helicopter. He also designed, in the early 1500s, a design that has been interpreted as a forerunner of the hang glider, a fixed-wing device on which a pilot could lie and which could theoretically glide on air currents. This is perhaps the closest practically functional of all his flying machine designs, and it anticipates the concept of unpowered fixed-wing flight by roughly 4 centuries. What was he actually trying to do with all this? Was he genuinely trying to build machines that would fly? Or was this primarily a theoretical and artistic investigation? The answer appears to be both. There is evidence in the notebooks that he was planning actual tests of various devices, with notes about locations where tests could be conducted in private, and instructions about testing over water in case of a crash. There is also evidence that he understood the gap between theoretical design and practical engineering, and was working to close it systematically. He was not simply dreaming. He was trying to solve a problem. He was also, without any question, enchanted by the idea of flight in a way that went beyond engineering. There is a quality in his drawings of birds in motion that is beyond scientific. It is the quality of someone who has looked at birds flying for so long and with such intensity that he has begun to feel what flight is from the inside. When he wrote about the moment a bird spreads its wings on a rising air current and holds itself there, motionless, perfectly balanced between its own weight and the lift of the air, He was writing about something he clearly found beautiful, in a way that resisted reduction to calculation. He wrote in his notebook on a page that appears to date from around 1505 the following words: "The great bird will take its first flight on the back of the great swan, filling the universe with amazement and filling all writings with its fame, and it will bring eternal glory to the nest where it was born." This was a reference to a specific planned test flight from Monte Ceccheri, a hill near Fiesole, outside Florence, using a device known as the Great Bird. Whether the test was ever conducted is uncertain. If it was, it did not result in successful flight, because successful flight in Leonardo's time would have been a historical event of unambiguous magnitude, and we would know about it. But the passage reveals something important about how Leonardo experienced his own work. He was not just an engineer trying to solve a technical problem. He was a person for whom the idea of flight carried enormous emotional and almost spiritual weight. The image of the great bird rising over the hills of Florence, filling the universe with amazement, is not an engineer's language. It is a poet's language, and Leonardo was, underneath the scientist and the painter and the engineer, always also a poet of the physical world. The flying machines connect to something broader in his work and in his thought, a recurring interest in the relationship between natural forms and human engineering, in what the natural world could teach us about how to build things, in what it would mean to understand nature so completely that you could replicate its most astonishing achievements. Flight was the most dramatic example, but the same impulse ran through his hydraulic engineering, his anatomy, his botany. He was always asking, how does nature solve this problem? And he believed that if you understood nature's solution well enough, you could apply the same principle to a human-made device. This was not foolish. It was, in many respects, the approach that biomimicry, a field of modern engineering, now systematically pursues. Leonardo was practicing biomimicry in the 15th century without having a name for it, guided by the intuition that nature was the most sophisticated engineer and that careful observation of the natural systems was the best possible engineering education. He never flew, his machines never flew, but the investigation itself, the thousands of hours of observation and calculation and drawing that went into it, shaped his understanding of fluid dynamics and structure and force in ways that fed back into everything else he did. The flying machines were not a failed project. They were part of the larger project of understanding how the world worked. And that project, we might as well say it clearly, was never going to be finished. There was always going to be more to understand. War, water, and the engineer of impossible things. The letter that Ser Piero sent to Ludovico Sforza in the early 1480s, proposing his son's services, was dominated by military engineering. This was not entirely honest advertising. Leonardo's military engineering credentials at the time of writing were largely theoretical. But it was smart advertising, because military engineering was what powerful men actually needed and were willing to pay for. Italy in the late 15th century was in a state of constant low-level conflict, punctuated by episodes of catastrophic violence. The Italian peninsula was divided among a shifting collection of city-states, kingdoms, duchies, and papal territories, each with its own interests and alliances and ambitions, all of them operating in the knowledge that they might be invaded by each other, or by France, or by the Ottoman Empire at any time. War was not an exception to normal political life, it was part of normal political life, and the technology of war was, in this period, undergoing rapid change driven by the increasing use of gunpowder weapons. The traditional medieval castle and its defences had been designed around the assumption that the primary instruments of siege were mechanical, catapults, and battering rams, and the slow, patient work of starving a garrison into submission. Gunpowder changed all of this. Cannon could shatter stone walls that had previously seemed impregnable. The design of fortifications had to change to accommodate the new reality. So did the design of weapons. There was a great and urgent demand for people who could think about these problems with genuine intelligence and creativity. Leonardo was not a soldier. He never commanded troops or personally led an assault or experienced combat in the way that a condottiere, a professional military commander, would have. But he was an extraordinarily capable engineer and designer, and he brought to military problems the same combination of systematic observation and creative lateral thinking that he brought to everything else. His military engineering notebooks contain designs for weapons and fortifications that range from the practically useful to the grandly visionary. He designed improved versions of the crossbow, drawn with meticulous attention to the mechanics of the bow and the forces acting on the bolt. He designed multi-barrel guns, what we would now call machine guns, with multiple barrels arranged in a fan shape that could be fired in sequence to maintain continuous fire, while the other barrels cooled and were reloaded. He designed armoured vehicles, closed platforms mounted on wheels and protected by angled armour plating, that could advance on enemy positions while protecting their occupants. These are sometimes cited as precursors to the tank, which is perhaps slightly generous, but not entirely wrong. He designed giant crossbows that were enormous mechanical instruments of siege rather than individual weapons. He designed devices for throwing stones with greater precision and power than conventional catapults. He designed portable bridges that could be erected quickly during military campaigns. He designed retractable bridges that could be raised to protect a position. He designed scaling ladders with a spring mechanism that would catch a soldier if the ladder was pushed away from a wall, which reflects a consideration of the human body and its vulnerability that is characteristically Leonardian. Some of these designs were probably viable, some were probably not. Leonardo did not always solve the practical problems his designs created, and some of his military engineering sketches have the quality of thought experiments, exploring the principle without fully working out the application. But taken as a body of work, they represent an extraordinary creative engagement with the problems of Renaissance warfare. He also worked on fortifications, designing systems of angled bastions and ditches that anticipated developments in military architecture that would not become standard until the 16th and 17th centuries. The Star Fort, with its angled projecting bastions designed to eliminate the blind spots in traditional round tower defences, was one of the defining architectural innovations of the early modern period. Leonardo's fortress designs from the 1490s and early 1500s show a clear understanding of these principles. Ludovico Sforza occasionally used Leonardo in actual military contexts, consulting him about specific problems of defence or siege, but the relationship between Leonardo's engineering work and real military applications was always a little uneasy. Leonardo, as is well documented, had complicated feelings about violence. He described war as pazzia bestialissima, the most beastly madness, in his notebooks. He deliberately withheld designs for submarine warfare as he recorded in his notebooks, because he felt that such weapons were too dangerous to make available to human beings who might misuse them. This combination, designing weapons while being privately horrified by war, is genuinely strange until you understand that for Leonardo, the designing was about understanding force and mechanism and engineering, while the revulsion was about what human beings actually did to each other. He could separate these things inside his head in a way that would seem more contradictory to most people than it apparently did to him. Water, however, was a different matter entirely. If there is one engineering subject that runs through Leonardo's entire career with consistent passion and sustained systematic investigation, it is water. He was fascinated by water in every dimension: hydraulics, fluid dynamics, hydrology, the movement of rivers and tides and waves and rain, the engineering of canals and locks and drainage systems and irrigation networks. This fascination began in observation. The notebooks from across his career are full of water studies of the most extraordinary kind. He drew water in motion with an attention and a precision that went far beyond artistic necessity. He drew the complex turbulence patterns that form when water meets an obstacle. He drew the spiral currents of whirlpools from above and from the side. He drew waves on a coast and in a stream and in a tub and the differences between them. He drew rain falling and the patterns it made on a still surface and the way the circles spread and intersected. He was doing something that had no name yet. He was doing fluid dynamics. He was trying to understand mathematically and physically and visually how liquids and gases move under different conditions. His observations about turbulence, about the way a fast-moving fluid creates eddies and spirals when it encounters resistance, were remarkably sophisticated. Some of what he described about water movement was not formally understood in physics until the 19th and 20th centuries. The engineering application of all this was enormous. Milan and Lombardy were crossed by a network of navigable canals, the navigli, that were economically vital and in constant need of maintenance, improvement, and extension. Leonardo worked on canal engineering in his Milan years, and again later in Florence and Rome, proposing improvements to navigation locks and drainage systems and flood control measures. He designed automated sluice gates. He designed systems for measuring water flow. He proposed engineering solutions to flood problems on the Arno River, the great river that flows through Florence, that were carefully worked out and never implemented. He also had grander visions. He proposed at various points engineering projects of genuinely enormous scale. A canal connecting Florence to the sea, which would have transformed the city's commercial situation. A scheme to divert the Arno River during a military campaign against Pisa, literally moving a river to deprive an enemy city of its water supply. An ambitious proposal for draining the Pontine marshes south of Rome, which were a breeding ground for malaria and a source of significant public health problems. These larger projects were never realized. Some were impractical for the technology of the time, some were simply too expensive and too politically complicated to organize. But they reveal something important about how Leonardo thought about engineering. He did not just solve problems as they presented themselves, he imagined what the problems would be and what the landscape could become if the right things were built in the right places. He was, in the most literal sense, a visionary engineer. He was also always watching. The hydraulic notes are full of observations that go beyond any specific engineering project. Observations about the behavior of water that serve no immediate practical purpose but that simply record the fact that Leonardo had seen something interesting and wanted to understand it. The way water flowing around a stone in a river creates a symmetrical wave pattern downstream. The way the surface tension of still water supports small insects and the mathematical implications of that support. The way a wave moves through water without actually moving the water. The way information propagates through a medium. This last observation he connected explicitly to sound and to light. He understood that waves in water, waves in air, and waves in a luminous medium might all be aspects of the same fundamental phenomenon of disturbance propagation. He was groping toward wave theory, the physics of how disturbances move through media, which would not be fully formalized for another 2 centuries. The water drawings are some of the most beautiful images in the entire corpus of the notebooks. The great deluge drawings made late in his life show water in a state of apocalyptic violence, vast turbulent floods that consume and overwhelm everything in their path, drawn with a technical mastery of fluid dynamics that was by then the product of 4 decades of observation and a visionary intensity that goes beyond technical demonstration into something closer to art. Water for Leonardo was both a technical subject and a metaphor. He wrote about it in his notebooks with a reverence that suggests it meant something to him beyond its engineering applications. He described it as the vehicle of nature, the driver of life, the source of rivers, the sustainer of all things. He was not being poetic in a decorative sense. He meant it. Water was, in his understanding of the natural world, as fundamental as light or air, and he never stopped trying to understand it. The return to Florence, rivalry with Michelangelo. In 1499, the French invaded Milan again. This time there was no recovery. Ludovico Sforza fled. The French occupied the city. The Sforza court, which had been Leonardo's home and employer and creative environment for 17 years, simply ceased to exist. And Leonardo, now 47 years old, found himself without a patron and without a clear future. What followed was a period of wandering. He travelled first to Venice, briefly, where he was asked to consult on the city's defences against Turkish incursion. He proposed a scheme for flooding the Isonzo Valley that was clever and almost certainly impractical. He then travelled to Mantua, where he made a famous portrait drawing of the Marchioness Isabella d'Este, who was one of the most sophisticated art patrons in Italy, and who desperately wanted a finished oil painting from him. He never delivered it. By 1500 or 1501, Leonardo had returned to Florence. He had been away for nearly 2 decades. Florence had changed. It had been through the extraordinary, brief and traumatic episode of Savonarola, the Dominican friar whose charismatic Puritanism had transformed the city in the 1490s, overturning the Medici tradition of luxurious humanist culture and culminating in bonfires of vanities in which citizens burned their mirrors and their jewellery and their books and their paintings. Savonarola himself had been burned in 1498, in the same piazza where he had burned everything else, and Florence was gradually returning to a version of its former self. But the cultural landscape was different. The easy patronage relationships of the Lorenzo era were gone. A new generation of artists had risen in Leonardo's absence, and one of them, in particular, was making everyone else look at their own work with fresh critical eyes. Michelangelo Buonarroti was 23 years younger than Leonardo, born in 1475, when Leonardo was already working in Verrocchio's workshop. By the time Leonardo returned to Florence in 1501, Michelangelo had already completed the Pietà, now in St. Peter's in Rome, a marble sculpture of such extraordinary beauty and technical mastery that it had made him famous across Italy while still in his mid-20s. He was working in the first years of the new century on the project that would make him a legend. The marble David, carved from a single enormous block of Carrara marble that had been abandoned by previous sculptors as damaged and unusable, stood completed in 1504. It is 5 meters tall. It shows the young David at the moment before his confrontation with Goliath, a moment of concentrated readiness, and it is one of the most extraordinary individual achievements in the entire history of Western art. Leonardo and Michelangelo disliked each other. This is documented, specific, and entirely mutual. The dislike was not simply professional rivalry, though it was certainly that. It appears to have been genuinely personal, a clash of temperaments and worldviews that ran deeper than competition. Michelangelo thought Leonardo was unreliable, a man who began things and abandoned them, who made beautiful preparatory work and then failed to follow through. He is reported to have said this, or something like it, directly to Leonardo's face, in public, which was not the most diplomatic approach. Michelangelo also, somewhat unfairly, associated Leonardo with a kind of Florentine aristocratic elegance that he found effete. Michelangelo's own aesthetic was rough, muscular and tortured. He identified with the suffering in his subjects, the marble resisting the sculptor's chisel, the human form straining against its own weight. Leonardo's art, with its sfumato softness and its atmospheric mystery, struck Michelangelo as beautiful but not serious. Leonardo, for his part, thought sculpture was a lesser art than painting, and had written as much in his theoretical work. He also appears to have found Michelangelo's personality genuinely difficult. Michelangelo was, by most accounts, a man of fierce moods, difficult to be around for extended periods, given to intensity that could tip into aggression. Leonardo preferred the company of people who were pleasant and witty, and did not make the room feel smaller. What they shared underneath the mutual irritation was an absolutely relentless perfectionism and an equally relentless need to understand what they were doing beyond the level of craft. They were both men who could not stop asking why. They just asked it about different things and got different kinds of answers. The great public confrontation between them, though confrontation is perhaps too dramatic a word, came in 1503 to 1505, when both were commissioned to paint large murals in the Sala del Gran Consiglio, the Great Council Hall, of the Palazzo della Signoria in Florence. The two paintings were to face each other across the room. Leonardo was assigned the Battle of Anghiari, depicting a Florentine military victory. Michelangelo was assigned the Battle of Cassina. Leonardo produced a cartoon, a full-scale preparatory drawing, for the Battle of Anghiari that caused a sensation when it was exhibited to the public. Contemporary accounts describe Florentines crowding to see it, the complex writhing mass of horses and soldiers at the centre of which two groups of cavalry fought over a battle standard. The figures were described as grotesquely vital, their faces contorted with effort and rage in a way that was intensely disturbing and intensely alive. It was recognised immediately as a work of extraordinary power. He then began to apply the paint to the wall and ran into catastrophic difficulty. He was experimenting again with the technique borrowed from ancient sources, a method involving heated wax or oil that would have given him the flexibility of working slowly that he could not achieve with fresco. The technique failed. The paint ran, or the heat warped the surface, or some combination of the two. He never finished the painting, and whatever he did apply has not survived. Michelangelo's Cassina was also never completed. He was called to Rome by Pope Julius II in 1505 and never returned to the project. The room that was to have contained the greatest double painting in the history of art was eventually covered over by later decoration, and the moment was lost. This double incompletion is one of the most tantalizing might-have-beens in all of art history. We have the copies and descriptions of what Leonardo's cartoon looked like. We have the drawings that survive from his preparation for the painting. We can imagine, at some level, what the two works might have looked like facing each other across the room. But the full actuality of it is gone. What we do know is that the competition between the two men, even at the level of preparatory cartoons, raised the standard of what Florentine art was expected to aspire to. Young artists copied both cartoons obsessively. The ideas in those preparatory drawings fed into the work of the next generation in ways that can be traced even today. Raphael, for instance, who was in Florence during these years, and who would become perhaps the third great figure of the High Renaissance alongside Leonardo and Michelangelo, showed in his paintings from this period a direct debt to what he had seen in both cartoons. The return to Florence also produced, during these years, one of Leonardo's most famous and most mysterious works. The work we will examine in its own chapter, the painting that has become, in 5 centuries, the most recognized image in the Western world. The Mona Lisa, the most famous painting in the world. The Mona Lisa hangs in the Louvre in Paris behind bulletproof glass in a purpose-built enclosure, set back from the velvet rope that keeps the crowds at a distance, surrounded at any given moment by what feels like half the world's population holding up smartphones. It is approximately 77 centimeters tall and 53 centimeters wide. It is painted in oil on a panel of poplar wood. It is considerably smaller than most people expect, which is one of the first surprising things about seeing it in person. I'm telling you this partly because the facts are interesting, and partly because I think it is worth establishing, before we go further, that the Mona Lisa is a real physical object with dimensions and materials, and that some of the mythology that has accumulated around it across 500 years can make it feel more like a concept than a thing. It is a thing. A thin layer of oil paint on a wooden board, made by a man in his 50s working in Florence in the early 1500s. And it is the most famous painting in the world. Both of those statements are true simultaneously. Who is the woman in the painting? The most widely accepted identification is Lisa Gherardini, the wife of a Florentine silk merchant named Francesco del Giocondo. Giorgio Vasari identifies the subject as Lisa del Giocondo in his Lives, and the painting is called La Gioconda in Italian and La Joconde in French for this reason. The commission, if that is what it was, may have been related to a domestic event, the birth of a son or the purchase of a new house. We do not know. Leonardo began the work around 1503 or 1504. What is remarkable is that he did not deliver it. He kept it. He worked on it for years, probably intermittently, carrying it with him through the remainder of his life in Italy and eventually to France, where it seems to have been essentially finished, or as finished as anything of Leonardo's was ever going to get sometime in the 15-teens. This means that the painting occupied him, at least periodically, for somewhere between 10 and 15 years. Why? What was he doing with it for all that time? Part of the answer is technical. The sfumato technique that gives the painting its extraordinary quality, the way the transitions between light and shadow are so gentle that they seem to exist in a register below the threshold of ordinary perception, required the application of dozens of extremely thin translucent glazes over a long period of time. Each glaze had to dry completely before the next was applied. The work was by its nature slow. But the length of time also suggests that this painting was not simply a commissioned portrait that he was struggling to finish. It was something else. Something he was using for a purpose that went beyond the original commission. Art historians have proposed various answers. Some suggest he was using it as a testing ground for technical effects, experimenting with the sfumato and atmospheric perspective that he was simultaneously developing in his theoretical notebooks. Some suggest the painting became a way of working through philosophical ideas about the relationship between the individual and the natural world, which is why the background, with its winding roads and misty mountains and the curious waterways that do not correspond to any specific Italian landscape, is as carefully developed as the figure. Some suggest that Leonardo simply became attached to it in a way that made it impossible to surrender, that it became the painting he was always in dialogue with. None of these explanations is exclusive of the others. What can be said with some confidence is that the painting represents the fullest realization of everything Leonardo had been working toward in his understanding of portraiture, and of the relationship between a human presence and the natural world that contains it. The subject looks out of the painting in a way that no previous portrait subject had quite looked out. She's not formal, not staged, not frozen in a conventional posture of social identity. She seems to have been caught in a moment of transition, the trace of an expression that is not quite a smile and not quite not a smile, that seems to be in the process of becoming something or just having been something else. This mobility of expression is not accidental. Leonardo wrote in his notebooks about the problem of catching in paint the transitional states of human expression, the moments between one emotional state and another, which are more revealing of character than the fixed expression of a specific emotion. The Mona Lisa's expression is a transitional state. It is the expression a person has when they are about to say something, or when they have just stopped saying something, or when they are thinking something they are not going to say. The mystery of it, and I use that word carefully because the painting's mysteriousness is real, and not just a cliché imposed on it by later centuries, comes from the fact that you cannot quite resolve it. You cannot decide what you're seeing. The uncertainty is built into the painting at the level of technique, the sfumato dissolving the edges of the smile so that it changes as the light changes and as your eye moves. It is not stable. Different people in the same room looking at the same painting have different experiences of what her expression is. There has been a great deal of scientific investigation of the painting in recent decades, using infrared reflectography and multispectral imaging and X-ray analysis. What this investigation reveals is interesting. There are earlier versions of the composition underneath the surface paint. The pose was adjusted, the landscape was changed, the columns on the sides of the balustrade were apparently present in an earlier state and later removed or left unpainted. The painting that exists was arrived at through a long process of revision and reconsideration, which is consistent with everything else we know about how Leonardo worked. The scientific investigation also confirms what careful looking suggests. The painting is technically extraordinary. The skin tones are built up through layers of glazes of such subtlety that reproducing them using modern pigments and techniques would be genuinely difficult. The atmosphere in the landscape behind the figure is painted with a delicacy that achieves a recession into space that practically no other painter of the period achieved. The transition from the lit portions of the face to the shadowed portions is so gradual that it seems to have no edges at all. The Mona Lisa became famous gradually and then enormously. It was not the most famous painting in the world from the moment of its creation. Leonardo's contemporaries admired it, but it did not immediately overtake The Last Supper or The Virgin of the Rocks in the hierarchy of his celebrated works. It passed to the French royal collection after Leonardo's death and hung for a long time in Versailles and later the Louvre without being specifically singled out as the supreme masterpiece. What changed was August 21st, 1911. On that date, a Louvre employee named Vincenzo Peruggia removed the painting from the wall, hid it overnight in the museum, and walked out the next morning with it under his coat. The theft was not discovered for 26 hours. When it was, it became the most sensational art crime in history. The Louvre was closed for a week. The French government launched a massive investigation. Pablo Picasso was briefly and absurdly a suspect. For 2 years, the Mona Lisa was missing, and the space where she had hung on the museum wall became a destination for visitors who came to see the empty space. Peruggia was arrested in Florence in 1913, trying to sell the painting to an art dealer. He had been keeping it in a trunk in his apartment. The painting was returned to France, and the furor of coverage around the theft and recovery established the Mona Lisa as the most famous painting in the world in a way that has not been seriously challenged since. This history of fame is not the reason the painting is great. It is great because of what Leonardo put into it across however many years he worked on it, but the fame is now inseparable from the painting in a way that makes it genuinely difficult to look at it fresh. Every image of it you've ever seen, every parody and reproduction and mug and postcard, every reference and joke sits between you and the actual object when you stand in front of it in the Louvre, which is why, if you ever get the chance, you should try, once, to stand in front of it very early in the morning when the crowds have not yet arrived, and just look at it for a few minutes without trying to have a defined reaction, or to settle the question of what her expression is. Just look at it the way Leonardo looked at things, with open patience and without deciding in advance what you're going to find. Because if you do that, you will probably notice something that the crowds and the bulletproof glass and the myths tend to obscure. The painting is very alive. The Second Milan period, science overtakes art. In 1506, Leonardo received a request from the French governor of Milan, Charles d'Amboise, to return to the city. He went, telling the Florentine authorities that he would be back in 3 months. He did not come back to Florence to live again for the rest of his life. The Second Milan period, lasting from 1506 to 1513, was different in character from the first. Ludovico Sforza was gone, imprisoned by the French and dead in 1508. The court that had given Leonardo his organizational context, his commission structure, his social position, no longer existed in the same form. The French were less certain patrons, their attention less consistent, and their aesthetic priorities somewhat different from the Italian courts he'd worked with. What this period gave Leonardo, more than previous periods, was time. Time to pursue his investigations without the pressure of a specific grand patron to satisfy, without the expectation of major public works, without the social and theatrical demands of court life that had consumed so much of his energy in the Sforza years. The notebooks from 1506 to 1513 are astonishing in their density and their range. This is the period when the anatomical studies reached their greatest depth. This is the period when the geological observations became most systematic. This is the period when the studies of optics and light achieved their most sophisticated development. He worked closely with the young aristocrat Francesco Melzi, who had joined his household around 1508 and would remain with him for the rest of his life, eventually becoming his primary companion and the guardian of the notebooks after his death. Melzi was not a great artist, though he was capable, and he was not a scientist. He was an intelligent, devoted young man who found in Leonardo an extraordinary teacher and friend. The relationship between them was clearly one of genuine affection, and Leonardo's late notebooks, which Melzi helped organize, reflect something of the ease that comes from being in the company of someone you trust entirely. The anatomical investigations of this period, conducted partly in collaboration with the young physician Marcantonio della Torre, who died of plague around 1511, represent the most systematic phase of Leonardo's scientific work. He was now approaching the body not just as an object of artistic study, but as a subject in its own right, worthy of investigation for its own sake. The drawings from this period include some of the most technically sophisticated representations of internal anatomy that would be produced until the 18th century. His studies of the brain and nervous system in these years were particularly remarkable. He was trying to understand the relationship between the sensory organs and the brain, to map the pathways through which information travelled from the eye and the ear and the skin to whatever central faculty of consciousness processed it. He injected hot wax into the ventricles of an ox brain to cast their shape and mapped the result with careful drawings. He drew the optic nerves and traced their path from the eye toward the brain, trying to understand where and how the visual information was decoded. He also continued his mechanical investigations with fresh energy. This is the period when his studies of machines became most systematically organized. The codex that would eventually be known as the Codex Atlanticus, the largest of the surviving notebook collections, contains material from across his career, but is particularly rich in material from these years. The mechanical investigations of this period include studies of transmission mechanisms, gearing systems, ways of converting rotary motion to linear motion, studies of friction and resistance, and the behavior of different materials under load. He was developing something like a theoretical mechanics, an understanding of the general principles that govern the behavior of machines, rather than just the specific characteristics of individual devices. He also returned in this period to his studies of water, and particularly to the question of large-scale hydraulic engineering. He made careful surveys of watercourses in Lombardy, and proposed improvements to navigation systems that were sophisticated and practical. He was in demand as an engineering consultant, and his notebooks from this period reflect a man who was applying his accumulated knowledge to real problems with confidence and precision. What diminished in this period, at least in terms of output, was painting. He was working on what appear to have been several paintings, including a Saint Anne composition on which he had been intermittently working since around 1501, and a Leda and the Swan, of which no original survives but whose composition is known from copies and drawings. He was also presumably continuing to work on the Mona Lisa, which he still had in his possession. But the painting commissions were fewer, and the scientific investigations more dominant. There is something poignant about this, though Leonardo himself may not have experienced it that way. He was in his mid-50s becoming less a painter who investigated science, and more a scientist who happened to have been a great painter. The transition was gradual and incomplete. He never stopped being a painter in his self-understanding, but the balance was shifting. He was also aware in these years that time was not unlimited. His notebooks from this period begin to contain more explicit reflections on his own situation, on the work he had not yet done, on the knowledge he had not yet organized, on the books he had planned to write. There is an urgency in some of these notes that was not so present earlier. He knew he was not going to finish everything. He was trying to decide what to finish first, which is always, in practice, a way of not finishing anything, but it reflects a real anxiety about legacy. In 1508 he wrote in a notebook a sentence that has haunted interpreters ever since. "I have wasted my hours." It is not clear exactly what prompted this note. It could have been a moment of acute frustration, a bad day, a project going wrong, or it could have been a genuine reckoning with the gap between what he had done and what he had planned to do. Either way, it is a remarkable statement from a man who had produced more in the preceding 5 decades than almost any other individual in the history of European culture. He was, as always, measuring himself against an impossible standard. the standard of everything that could be known, understood, and made. Against that standard, he would always be falling short. It was the same quality that made him extraordinary, the inability to accept that what he had done was enough, that made him suffer. Rome and the shadow of younger men. In 1513, the political situation in Italy shifted again, as it so often did. The French were expelled from Milan by a coalition of Italian and Spanish forces, and Leonardo lost his connection to the French-sponsored Milan court. At the same time, Giovanni de' Medici, the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, was elected pope and took the name Leo X. The Medici were back in power, in Rome rather than Florence, and the cultural centre of Italy was shifting. Leonardo went to Rome in 1513. He was 61 years old. He had been working at the highest levels of Italian art and culture for nearly 40 years. His reputation was immense, and yet, in Rome in 1513, he found himself in a position that was distinctly uncomfortable. The problem was Michelangelo and Raphael. Both of them were in Rome. Both of them were, in this particular moment, at the absolute peak of their powers. Michelangelo had just finished the Sistine Chapel ceiling, completed in 1512, which was instantly recognised as an achievement of staggering magnitude. Raphael was painting the stanze, the papal apartments in the Vatican, with a clarity and grace and compositional intelligence that made his reputation the equal of any living painter. Both men were younger than Leonardo. Both men were being given the major commissions, and both men cast a very long shadow. Pope Leo X gave Leonardo a studio in the Vatican complex and a regular stipend, which was generous in its own right, but the major commissions, the ones that would have given the period its public legacy, did not come. Leonardo was respected, consulted, admired. He was not being asked to paint the walls of the great buildings of Rome. He was working in his studio on scientific investigations and on preparations for various painting projects that do not appear to have progressed very far. He was experimenting with new varnishes and new preparation techniques, which led to the famous story that when he was given a painting commission in Rome, the new patron discovered Leonardo mixing oils and herbs for a new varnish, rather than beginning the painting, and complained to the Pope that Leonardo would never finish anything because he was thinking about the end before the beginning. Pope Leo X reportedly responded with the observation that this man would never do anything, for he thinks of the end before the beginning. Whether the story is completely accurate is uncertain, but it has the ring of truth. Leonardo's preparation habits were genuinely maddening to people waiting for results. He was also, in Rome, surrounded by intrigues and difficulties that he found deeply unpleasant. A German mirror maker and craftsman named Giovanni degli Specchi, who worked in his studio, appears to have stolen some of his designs and shared them with rivals. Leonardo complained bitterly about this in his notebooks and in letters, with an outrage that suggests he found the betrayal genuinely shocking, which in turn suggests that he was perhaps not always as guarded in his professional relationships as his general caution might imply. There is in the Rome period a note of isolation and mild defeat that is genuinely sad. This was not objectively a bad situation. A studio in the Vatican, a papal stipend, the admiration of everyone who encountered him, these were not things to complain about. But Leonardo, who had spent most of his career in the role of the most remarkable mind in whatever room he was in, was now in a city where the most remarkable minds in the room were other people. Younger people, people who were completing major works while he continued to investigate and plan and prepare. He was also, physically, beginning to age. There is some evidence that he suffered a stroke or some kind of cardiovascular event in his late 50s or early 60s that affected the mobility of his right hand. Since he was left-handed, this would not have prevented him from writing or drawing, but it was a reminder of the body's limitations in a way that someone who had spent so much time studying the body's mechanisms could hardly have ignored. What he did produce in Rome was not painting, but something else. More geological investigations, studies of the Pontine marshes and plans for their drainage, systematic observations of the Roman archaeological remains, which interested him as evidence about ancient engineering rather than for their art historical value, studies of fossil shells found in the hills around Rome, which he continued to interpret as evidence of an ancient seafloor that had been elevated over very long periods of time. He also produced in these years a series of drawings that are among the most extraordinary and most disturbing things he ever made. The apocalyptic drawings, known as the deluge drawings, show water in a state of violent catastrophic motion, vast floods consuming mountains and engulfing cities, drawn with the technical mastery of someone who had spent 40 years studying fluid dynamics, and with the emotional intensity of someone confronting the possibility of the end of everything. They are not illustrations for a text. They appear to be private works, made for himself rather than for any patron, exploring something that was on his mind in ways that he did not want to articulate directly. Death and time. The great themes that had been circling his notebooks for decades were pressing more closely in Rome. He was getting old. He had not finished his books. He had not organized his knowledge. He had not made all the things he planned to make. He was, in some fundamental sense, still not done, and there was increasingly little time left to finish. In 1516, salvation came from an unlikely direction. Francis I, the young king of France, invited Leonardo to come to France as his personal court painter and engineer, and really as his court philosopher, his resident genius, the man whose very presence at the court of Fontainebleau and later the Loire Valley would indicate to Europe what kind of a king Francis was and what kind of a court he kept. It was the most generous and the most intelligent act of patronage that anyone offered Leonardo in the entire second half of his life. It was also very likely the thing that gave him the peace he needed to spend his final years in something other than frustration. He accepted. France and the final years. The journey from Rome to France in the autumn of 1516 was not a short one. Leonardo travelled over the Alps by mule, which at 64 years old and with whatever physical limitations he was now managing, was not trivial. He brought with him Francesco Melzi, his devoted companion of 8 years. He brought with him several of his most important paintings, including the Mona Lisa. He brought the notebooks. He arrived in the Loire Valley and was installed in a small manor house called Clos Lucé in the town of Amboise, connected by an underground passage to the royal chateau, so that the king could visit him easily and privately. Francis I, who was 22 years old to Leonardo's 64, was exactly the kind of patron that Leonardo had never quite had before. He was not primarily interested in getting paintings out of Leonardo, though he appreciated the paintings that Leonardo had brought. He was interested in Leonardo's company, in his conversation, in his ideas, in what it felt like to be in the same room with a mind of that quality. He said, according to the Florentine sculptor Benvenuto Cellini, who heard it reported, that he could not believe there had ever been another man born into the world who knew as much as Leonardo, not only about painting, sculpture, and architecture, but because Leonardo was a great philosopher. This is the key word, philosopher. Not craftsman, not artist, not engineer. Philosopher. Francis understood that what Leonardo was doing in the notebooks and the investigations was something more than professional expertise. It was the attempt to understand the world comprehensively, to know how things worked and why, to find the principles that connected the behavior of water and the structure of muscle and the way light moved through air. That project did not have a name in 1516, but Francis recognized it as the most ambitious thing a human mind could attempt, and he valued it accordingly. Leonardo was given a pension equivalent to approximately 2,000 gold crowns per year, which was an extraordinary sum. He was given Clos Lucé and its grounds to live in. He was asked for nothing specific in return beyond his presence and his conversation, and whatever he chose to make. It was the most generous possible definition of a sinecure, and it was exactly what Leonardo needed for the last 3 years of his life. He did not stop working. The notebooks from the French period show him still investigating, still recording, still planning. He produced studies for court entertainments and theatrical spectacles that Francis loved. He designed an ideal city for a new town on the Solon plain that was never built. He worked on hydraulic projects related to the Loire River. He continued his geological studies, made observations about the local landscape, recorded thoughts about time and water and the age of the earth. He also, in France, finally achieved something approaching the organized presentation of his work on painting that he had been planning for decades. The manuscript known as the Treatise on Painting, eventually compiled from his notes after his death by Francesco Melzi, drew heavily on material that Leonardo appears to have organized or reorganized in his French years. It was published in France in 1632, over 100 years after his death, and was enormously influential on European art for the following 2 centuries. It was the closest thing he produced to a finished book. The Mona Lisa was in France with him. The French court had access to it. When Leonardo died, the painting appears to have remained in France, eventually entering the royal collection. It was from the royal collection that it passed to the Louvre. The French have had it ever since, which has been a periodic source of Italian irritation, though the legal situation is not as simple as the passion of the argument sometimes suggests. In 1517, Leonardo received a visit from Cardinal Luigi d'Aragona and his secretary Antonio de Beatis, who kept a travel diary. The account that Beatis left of this visit is one of the most detailed and most poignant records of Leonardo in his final years. He describes a man who is still physically impressive but whose right hand has been affected by some kind of paralysis, confirming earlier suggestions of a stroke. He describes Leonardo showing his paintings, including what is clearly the Mona Lisa and what appears to be a St. John the Baptist and the St. Anne with the Virgin and Child. He describes Leonardo showing his anatomical drawings, which de Beatis describes as being so accurate and complete that he thought they would be of great use to anyone studying medicine. He also describes Leonardo as old, over 70, though Leonardo was actually 65 at the time, which is either an error or a reflection of how the illness and the decades of intense intellectual work had marked him. What de Beatis does not describe is a man who had given up. He was still showing his work. He was still talking about it. He was still, in some essential way, engaged. He died on the 2nd of May 1519 at Clos-Lucé. He was 67 years old. The death, like almost everything else about him, attracted mythology immediately. Vasari, who was only 8 years old when Leonardo died, and writing decades later, described a deathbed scene in which Francis I cradled Leonardo's head in his arms as he died, which is extraordinarily romantic and almost certainly not literally true. Francis was almost certainly at a different royal residence that day, but the image stuck because it captured something emotionally true about the relationship between the old man and the young king, the extraordinary generosity of recognition that Francis had extended to Leonardo when the world was no longer quite sure what to do with him. He left the notebooks to Francesco Melzi, along with his clothes and tools and the monetary contents of a bank account. He left money to his servants. He left his other possessions to his half-brothers, the legitimate children of Ser Piero, with whom he had had a complicated and sometimes litigious relationship across the years. The paintings, including the Mona Lisa, appear to have remained in France by a different mechanism. Melzi spent the rest of his life, another 50 years, organising and preserving the notebooks as best he could. After Melzi's death, the collection began to disperse, eventually scattering to the institutions and private collections across Europe where it remains today. The grave where Leonardo was originally buried in the church of Saint-Florentin in Amboise was later disturbed by the wars of religion, and his remains were probably mixed with others or lost. What is now presented as his tomb in a chapel of the Château d'Amboise is there by a reconstruction of evidence and a reasonable best guess. He left behind, in the end, fewer than 20 paintings that can be attributed to him with certainty. Thousands of pages of notebooks, a revolution in painting technique, a revolution in anatomical investigation, the foundations of several scientific disciplines that would not be named for another century or two, an uncast horse, several unfinished books, and a smile that 500 years later still refuses to resolve into something you can fully name. Not a bad life's work, all things considered. The legacy, 500 years ahead. When we try to assess what Leonardo left behind, we run immediately into the problem of his method, which is the same problem that defined his life. He was not organised for legacy. He did not prepare his work for public consumption. The notebooks, which are the most extraordinary part of his intellectual achievement, were private documents never intended for publication, and they remained largely inaccessible for generations after his death. The paintings, his more public legacy, were in many cases damaged, incomplete, or scattered across institutions that did not necessarily understand what they had. The Mona Lisa was in a French royal chateau. The Last Supper was already deteriorating on its refectory wall. The Virgin of the Rocks existed in two versions whose attribution and history were both complicated. The Adoration of the Magi was unfinished in a Florentine collection. The situation was, in the most literal sense, a mess. And yet Leonardo was famous, enormously, immediately, persistently famous. Vasari's Lives, published in 1550, the first major edition, and 1568, the second and expanded edition, devoted one of its longest and most admiring chapters to Leonardo, and established the terms in which he would be discussed for the next several centuries. The genius who was too great for any single discipline, too curious to finish what he started, too ahead of his time to be fully understood in it. These tropes are Vasari's inventions mostly, though they are based on real observations. And they stuck. In the 17th and 18th centuries, copies of some of the notebook material began to circulate more widely. Artists and engineers and natural philosophers who encountered fragments of the notebooks were astonished. The anatomical drawings, when they were seen, were recognized as being generations ahead of what had been published in the standard anatomical texts. The mechanical studies were recognized as addressing problems in mechanics that the formal scientific tradition was still working through. The geological observations were, to those who encountered them, startling in their implications, but the notebooks were too scattered, too various, too dense, and too written in mirror script for easy absorption. They were not systematically published until the 19th century, when a series of scholarly editions began to make the material available. By that point, the scientific revolution that Leonardo had anticipated had already happened without him, and his role had to be assessed retrospectively. The 19th century's assessment was sometimes extravagant. The Romantics loved Leonardo for all the obvious reasons. The tormented genius, the man ahead of his time, the universal mind suffering for its universality, these were exactly the ingredients for Romantic myth-making. He was cast as a figure of tragic grandeur, which is not entirely inaccurate but which emphasizes the pathos at the expense of the energy. The 20th century brought a more careful and in many ways more interesting scholarly engagement. The notebooks began to be transcribed and translated systematically. The paintings were subjected to technical analysis. The relationship between the art and the science was examined with increasing sophistication. And what emerged from this engagement was a picture of Leonardo that was simultaneously more human and more remarkable than the Romantic myth. More human, because the careful reading of the notebooks revealed not a serene godlike intellect, but a man of intense anxieties and specific obsessions and ordinary daily frustrations. A man who complained about his assistants and worried about money and made shopping lists and got into arguments with monks about overdue paintings and left notes to himself to remember to ask someone how they ice skate in Flanders. A man, in other words, who was recognizably a person rather than a monument. More remarkable, because the closer you look at the specific content of the notebooks, the more consistently extraordinary it turns out to be. Not just in the famous examples, the flying machines and the anatomical drawings and the geological observations, but in the texture of every page, the quality of attention brought to every problem, the refusal to be satisfied with approximate understanding, the insistence on going further and looking harder, and asking why again when the first answer turns out to be insufficient. Consider some specific examples of how far ahead he actually was. His studies of the formation of fossils and his interpretation of rock strata as the record of deep geological time anticipate the development of stratigraphy by William Smith in the early 19th century by roughly 300 years. His anatomical drawings of the heart and the circulation of blood contain observations about valve function and blood flow patterns that anticipate discoveries by William Harvey in 1628 by 130 years. His designs for a solar energy concentrator, a large mirror system designed to concentrate sunlight to produce industrial heat, which he designed for a textile finishing application in the early 1500s, anticipate the development of solar thermal technology by approximately 400 years. His studies of water turbulence and vortex formation contain observations that anticipate developments in the formal study of fluid dynamics by Helmholtz and Kelvin in the 19th century by 350 years. His embryological drawings, particularly of the developing fetus, contain observations about placental structure and fetal development that anticipate the formal discipline of embryology by several centuries. His studies of the behavior of light in the eye, including his correct description of the inverted image formed on the retina, anticipate developments in optics that would not be formally systematized until Kepler in the early 17th century. The list could go on. In essentially every field of investigation he pursued, Leonardo produced observations and insights that were substantially ahead of the formal development of those fields as scientific disciplines. This is not a matter of one or two lucky guesses. It is the systematic product of a method that was, in fundamental respects, more modern than the methods of the formal scientific tradition of his own time. Why then did his work not change the history of science? Why did the scientific revolution proceed without him? The answer is complex and slightly uncomfortable for anyone who admires him. First, his work was private. The notebooks were not published. The ideas could not circulate and be tested and built upon. Science as an institutional activity depends on communication, on the sharing of findings so that others can verify them, contradict them, and extend them. Leonardo's findings were not shared in the relevant way. they remained, for most practical purposes, invisible to the tradition he was anticipating. Second, his work was disorganized. Even if the notebooks had been available, extracting the relevant content would have required a level of editorial effort that was not available. The ideas are embedded in thousands of pages of diverse material, without indexing, without systematic organization, without the apparatus that would make them usable as a scientific foundation. Third, and most fundamentally, Leonardo was working alone. The scientific tradition that he anticipated was not built by individual geniuses working in isolation. It was built by communities of scholars who built on each other's work. Galileo built on Copernicus, Newton built on Galileo and Kepler and Hooke. The cumulative, collaborative nature of the scientific enterprise is what gives it its extraordinary power. Leonardo, for all his genius, was a single node without a network. This is the melancholy paradox of his legacy. The notebooks are extraordinary documents. They are also, in an important sense, dead ends. The ideas in them did not propagate. They did not enter the bloodstream of intellectual history. They had to be rediscovered by each generation of scholars who found them in the archives, already long since made obsolete by the very developments they had anticipated. But this is not the whole story. Because the paintings did circulate, the techniques did influence. The way Leonardo looked at the world, the combination of close observation and mathematical reasoning and artistic sensitivity, did enter the cultural bloodstream through the paintings and through the copies and engravings of the paintings, and through the artists who studied under him and the artists who studied under them. Raphael, who spent time in Florence when Leonardo's preparatory cartoons for the Battle of Anghiari were being exhibited, shows in his Roman paintings a direct debt to Leonardo's compositional methods and his approach to the human figure. Giorgione in Venice developed a landscape style that owed a clear debt to Leonardo's atmospheric perspective. The Lombard painters who worked in Leonardo's circle in Milan, the so-called Leonardeschi, disseminated a diluted but recognizable version of his approach across northern Italy. And beyond the direct artistic influence, there is the broader cultural influence of Leonardo as an idea. The idea that the artist and the scientist could be the same person. The idea that the most rigorous observation of the natural world was not opposed to beauty but was the deepest possible source of it. The idea that every question was worth asking, that no field of knowledge was too humble or too grand to be worth the effort of serious investigation. These ideas, transmitted partly through the paintings, and partly through the romantic mythology, and partly through the eventual publication of the notebooks, became formative for the development of a certain kind of intellectual culture that continues to the present day. The culture that values interdisciplinary thinking, that sees the artificial boundaries between art and science as obstacles rather than conveniences, that insists on asking why rather than accepting what. Leonardo did not invent this culture, but he is its most eloquent and most complete embodiment, the figure to whom it points when it wants to show what it values and what it aspires to. There is one more dimension of his legacy that deserves attention, and it is perhaps the most personal. The notebooks contain, distributed among all the technical material, and the shopping lists, and the scientific observations, a kind of spiritual autobiography of an extraordinary mind. The notes he wrote to himself about his failures and his aspirations and his experience of time and beauty and loss. These notes are not published as literature, and they do not constitute a coherent narrative, but they are among the most moving documents of intellectual life ever produced. The man who wrote, "Tell me if anything was ever done," in a moment of acute self-criticism, was also the man who wrote with joy about a ray of light entering a camera obscura and producing an inverted image of the world on the opposite wall, and saw in that small dark room a model of human perception and of the eye's relationship to the world outside it. The man who dissected cadavers by candlelight to understand how the blood moved through the chambers of the heart was the same man who wrote that the greatest form of art was to paint the soul of a person. He was trying to understand everything, and he knew he would not succeed, and he kept trying anyway. That combination of ambition and awareness and persistence in the face of incompletion is not unique to genius. It is the condition of any serious intellectual life. What is extraordinary about Leonardo is the scale at which he operated and the quality of what he produced despite, and in some ways because of, the impossibility of what he was attempting. He was not 500 years ahead of his time because he was alien to his time. He was 500 years ahead of his time because he looked at his time more carefully than anyone else did, and what he saw pointed forward. The world he was looking at was the same world we inhabit. The principles he was discovering are the principles we still rely on. The questions he was asking are the questions we're still asking. 500 years in the history of a species is not actually very long. Long enough to change almost everything about how we live. Short enough that the questions that occupied Leonardo da Vinci in the 1500s are recognizable as the questions that occupy us now. That is his most fundamental legacy. Not the Mona Lisa, not the flying machines, not the anatomical drawings. Those are the evidence. The legacy itself is the demonstration that a single human mind, paying close enough attention over a long enough lifetime, can touch the edges of things that matter for longer than any one life. And so the story of Leonardo da Vinci comes to its quiet end. Or rather, it arrives at the place where any telling of his story must eventually arrive, the recognition that it does not quite have an end. The notebooks are still being studied. The paintings are still being examined under new lights and new technologies. The questions he was asking are still being refined and asked again in different forms. The great project he devoted his life to, the attempt to understand the world fully and truthfully, is still underway. He was born in a small Tuscan village in 1452, the illegitimate son of a notary and a woman whose name history did not fully record. He died in a French chateau in 1519, with the most famous painting in the world among his possessions and thousands of pages of unfinished investigations on his desk. In between, he looked at everything. He drew everything. He asked about everything. He finished almost nothing, which is either a failure or the natural consequence of setting yourself the goal of understanding the whole of the natural world, depending on how generous you are feeling. I lean toward the generous interpretation. But then, I always do. What I find most moving about Leonardo, thinking about him in the quiet of the night, is not the genius. Genius is difficult to relate to. It is the looking. The habit that must have been there from the very beginning, from the boy following his uncle Francesco through the olive groves above Vinci, stopping to look at a beetle or a flower, or the way the light changed on the hillside at a particular hour of the afternoon. The habit of finding the world, in all its detail and variation and complexity, genuinely interesting. Not performing interest, not noting things because they might be useful later, finding them interesting because they were interesting, because the world was there and it was worth paying attention to. Most of us lose that quality somewhere along the way. There are too many other demands, too much noise. The habit of looking closely at things gradually gives way to the habit of getting through the day. Leonardo never entirely made that trade. He retained, into his 60s, a kind of attentiveness that most of us associate only with childhood, that quality of genuine curiosity in front of the actual world that is the beginning of every real understanding. That is the thing to take away from tonight, if you take away anything. Not the flying machines or the anatomical drawings or the greatest smile in art history, though those are all worth carrying with you, but the habit of looking carefully at the thing in front of you. The willingness to ask why one more time, the refusal to accept that any corner of the world is too small or too ordinary to be worth serious attention. Leonardo thought everything was worth serious attention. It was the root of everything he ever did. Now the night has settled in around you. The story has reached its end, or as close to an end as Leonardo's story can reach. The hills outside Vinci are still there, rolling in long green waves toward Florence, the cypress trees standing in their dark vertical lines. The notebooks are in the archives, their mirror script pages still densely covered with observations and questions and plans and shopping lists, and the occasional moment of pure joy at something he had just understood for the first time. The Mona Lisa hangs in the Louvre, behind its bulletproof glass, her expression still refusing to settle into something you can finally name. Let the thinking slow. Let the images drift and soften. The kite wheeling over Vinci in the blue Tuscan sky. The candlelight in Verrocchio's workshop catching the edge of a silver lyre. The first mark of chalk on a large Italian wall. The steady sound of a quill on paper in the middle of the night in a room in Milan or Florence or Amboise. While outside the stars turned in their courses and Leonardo da Vinci sat at his desk trying to understand one more thing before he ran out of time. He did not run out of curiosity. He never did. Let your eyes close. Let the darkness settle like sfumato, like the softest possible transition between light and the absence of it. The notebooks can wait. The questions can wait. Leonardo, who slept only in brief intervals and worked through the night and always felt there was more to do, would understand if for once you just rested. Good night. Thank you for spending the night with Almighty Sleep. If you found this journey worthwhile, please consider subscribing and let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I love knowing who joins us for these late-night dives into history. Until next time, take care of yourselves and keep looking closely at things.